A lumbering giant looms large over the world of Battletech. From ancient times until the most recent, desperate effort and clash for survival across human space. This creature of engineered steel and myomers, however, was shackled with a bleak reputation, one which was in place for much of its existence. Instead of bearing the proud legacy that its creators imagined for it, it was associated mostly with three words: obsolete, unwanted, and despised. This uninspired titan became the paper tiger of the Inner Sphere in the years that followed the rise of the Star League. Only through the strife-filled straits of the Succession Wars, and simply because they were left in storage for use, did this primordial war machine begin to emerge onto the battlefields once more, and to disastrous effect for those that piloted it, or were forced to rely upon it. Stagnation and decline across the human empires that span the stars, though, meant that machines as unfavorable as this failed venture had some sort of home, even if they were unwanted by their operators. But stagnation does not last forever. The fires of war eventually became the forge that sharpened and hardened this dulled blade into the deadliest of edges. What was once considered awful gained in value rapidly, becoming one of the strongest battle mechs to walk across the Inner Sphere. And this took place just in time, as the clan invasion swept into the Great Houses only a handful of years later. The Lyran half of the Federated Commonwealth, the power responsible for reshaping this weapon into a brutal fighting machine, found themselves clinging onto vain hopes for survival. The mech they reforged was then tested against this new foe, and every foe that has arisen since. In this overview, we are going to examine the stories and history around one of the most iconic weapons platforms in the history of Battletech. But more than that, this is a tale of a battle mech going from the obscure corners of history and being launched into the center stage of some of the most destructive and consequential fighting ever. So, without any reason left to delay, let us examine this once slumbering Terran juggernaut. The Banshee. It hit me then that my colleagues and I had just turned loose one of the most powerful weapons ever conceived by man, but we were celebrating like giddy children, while my companions jumped up and down with glee. That poor boy was trying to hide the fact that in the instant his screen went black, he had wet his pants. The Hegemony Research and Development Department, Military Weapon Systems Division, Document 0324610.04. Comstar Archives. Terra. The Banshee's journey truly does not start with the Succession Wars, or even with the famed Star League of old, but at the very dawn of the battle mech itself. To understand it in its entirety, we must begin our exploration there. The 25th century was an era of turmoil and conflict. This was also where the great powers of the Inner Sphere all began to emerge, almost like celestial bodies forming around a newborn star. The major nations of the Inner Sphere began to coalesce, as their political, military, and economic gravities seemed to draw in worlds and lesser powers around them. The new lords of these great powers were the embodiment of avarice, always craving more glory, more territories, and the ability to dominate their neighbors. At the very core of human space, though, lay the star at the center of this political solar system. Terra's first stellar empire had collapsed sometime earlier, with the death of the Terran Alliance. Though it was not the oldest of the Great Houses, as the Free Worlds League had come together prior to this new iteration of the Terran Empire. But this new state was still at the central point of power in human space. Backed by the most sophisticated military-industrial complex in human history to this point, the Terran Hegemony, the successor to the Alliance, was always at the bleeding edge of military and technological developments. No one could foresee, however, the massive leap that the Hegemony was about to make in terms of battlefield technologies, near the middle of the century, during the Age of War. Director General Jacob Cameron, while he was not the inventor of the battle mech, was its greatest champion. As ruthless as any of his House Lord peers across human space, Jacob had attempted to dominate his neighbors through much of his reign through flexing the Hegemony's military might, and the military domination of nearby powers became much more likely in 2439, after the first demonstration by the Hegemony Research and Development Department of the battle mech. This was the year of the successful test for the Mackie. Marrying advanced myomer technologies, in essence advanced synthetic muscles, with a humanoid frame, and for the time cutting-edge weaponry, they had created something not only unique, but also absolutely dominating. This was, at the time, a leap in technology well beyond anything anyone had yet seen, and the Director General recognized it as such. He knew the potential of these platforms, and would not allow this opportunity to slip through his fingers. Every possible resource was reoriented towards the production of these new devastating weapons of war. Whole new, advanced factory complexes were built in the safest regions of Terra's holdings. Every element of the military's budget was raided for revenue to progress this advantage, and eventually, so too was the civilian government's budget. Jacob Cameron bled his realm white in terms of its productive capacity and tax revenue to ensure that these breakthrough systems would be prioritized to ensure their military supremacy against all other states. Terran industries and infrastructure were built up for this machine to be mass-produced, with 6 factories being put into full production by the end of its development. It's important to point out that early battlemechs in general were all very primitive in nature, regardless of their success or lack thereof on the battlefield. They were burdened with extremely heavy engines and very poor protection compared to any modern battlemech, using technologies even simpler than what would be considered intro tech. By the standards of anything that followed, the Mackie was slow, poorly defended, and inadequately armed for its tonnage. But to the opponents of the Hegemony, it was a demon. While all other mechs descended from this bizarre construct in some way, the Mackie also directly led to another much more innovative and advanced battlemech for the time. Its time at the top of the mountain, even within the Hegemony armed forces, was not very long. The very people involved with the construction of the original battlemech, in fact, believed they could build a much better product. Contractors and staff from the project began to propose developing a more refined fighting machine, and one which would surpass their first work in all ways which mattered most. The true advantage of the battlemech's body plan could be built upon, enhancing the machine based off of its human frame. Gone would be the visage of a waddling robot from the 1950s, one which lacked true arms or grace. No, what they had in mind was a revolution, upon the breakthrough design they had already made, pushing boundaries beyond where they were seemingly set by the first in class only a few years prior. It only took a few days of the first battlemech being adopted and being put into the field that this development process pushed ahead to expand the range of platforms. Terra, through Hegemony weapons research, wanted its manufacturers to deliver another devastating battlemech in the same vein as their first Colossus. But this time, due to lessons learned, it'd be something vastly more refined and substantially more evolved. When the Hegemony armed forces began launching competitions for new designs, the first victory was an upset, and went to Martinson Armaments for their revolutionary 45-ton battlemech. the Cayudo, in 2443. Not willing to be upstaged again, when the next bid was put up by the Hegemony, Hegemony Weapons Research delivered a new, terrifying weapon of war for the age. This winner was to be a mech that, after being adopted, would be in some form of service in human space, continuously, from that moment forwards. The BNC-1E Banshee was Hegemony Weapons Research's pitch in this second competition, and it won. The team that had developed the mech took almost every lesson they could from their prior success and advanced upon it. A slightly lighter 95 tons instead of their original 100-ton offering of the Mackie, the Banshee was more smartly developed than anything. Unlike the Mackie, its body was not a poor impersonation of a dive suit from the early 20th century, with little arms attached to it. Instead, it was a robust, refined, and sleek mech. It took on the form of a humanoid proper, but most importantly, it expanded on something that had been untapped in the first battle mech. Mechwarriors, even from these early days, were very prone to utilizing physical attacks, and the Mackie, while it could kick, certainly had no ability to functionally punch or even to grab things. What was the point behind a humanoid form if one couldn't take advantage of said ape-like shape? Hegemony Weapons Research completely agreed, and when they tackled this new design, the Banshee was built to appear more human, including having fully articulating arms and hands in response to Mechwarrior feedback. In fact, the Banshee also borrowed heavily from its predecessor in terms of its weaponry, having a very similar loadout, though its systems were all torso-mounted, instead of being arm-mounted, meaning the mech could throw punches as needed, while still firing its primary weapons. The most impressive single aspect of this new Titan, however, was that despite being almost the same size as the Mackie, despite being more sophisticated, and in spite of the fact it took only a few short years to develop, it was substantially cheaper and vastly easier to maintain. This made it, for the middle of the 25th century, truly a devastating weapon of war. There is often a misguided belief that war is won by superior arms, but in industrial warfare, this is not the case. The army that can easily deliver supplies and keep its army in the fight the longest, so long as they are somewhat capable, will typically win a conflict. The BNC-1E was an example of everything that embodies, and just shows how dangerous the Terran state and its military-industrial complex were at the time. It was a mech that was more sophisticated than its predecessor, yet easier to service. It was similarly armed, yet had additional features. It was newer and functionally better in every major respect in regards to warfighting, yet cost less. This is what real advancement in military procurement looks like. In other words, more Banshees could be built and put into the field than the Mackie, despite it being superior to its predecessor. On top of that, the designers understood psychological warfare. The first mech to ever have a skull represented in their frame was the Banshee, and it produced a terror-causing effect on the forces arrayed against it. If one looked upon the Banshee in this state, and froze time upon its introduction in 2445, they would have assumed that it was the path of the future. Hundreds of these mechs were procured for the Hegemony armed forces. They were the steel warriors for the mightiest state in the human sphere. Unfortunately, as this legion of equipment was being assembled, and even fighting and winning wars, technology leaped ahead greatly in the years that followed its deployment. Until the latter portion of the 25th century, the Banshee-1E was truly the king of the battlefield. But in this age of technological expansion, especially as the other great houses began building their own armies of battle mechs, having taken the technology for themselves, the Banshee's place at the top was to be challenged sooner than its developers would have ever hoped for. The dream of permanence in the unchallenged era of Terran dominance was over, at least as to how it was envisioned by the Terran Alliance, and the early days of the Hegemony. The Mackie and the Banshee, very much the faces of these policies and ideas, were to fall to the wayside of history. Though the latter of these two was not given up on quite as readily, it would seem. First put into production in 2439, the Mackie is the original battle mech, at least as far as widespread production models are concerned. For all its impressiveness upon its debut, however, it, as a design, did not possess the same staying power as many other battle mechs that followed it. Crippled by its extremely primitive technology by the end of the century it was introduced, the MSK-5S Mackie was, in its day, a horrifying machine to come across all the same, even if that reputation did not last long. An assault mech weighing in at 100 tons, the Mackie definitely seems to be the first mech in all of the worst ways. It uses a primitive cockpit and other internal components. It uses standard heat sinks, of which it has 17, and this lets it run relatively cool despite its lack of advanced systems. For mobility, it runs a primitive 33-ton 360 standard engine, letting it move up to 56 km per hour or 5 movement points in the tabletop game. This is not exceptional, but for a 100-ton assault mech, it's the expected level of mobility, even into the eras after this mech's arrival. It does mean that its mobility on the battlefield, however, is quite limited. For armored protection, the 5S has 20 tons of primitive plating, giving it 214 points of protection. This kind of armor, it should be noted, being primitive, does not offer much protection from the mech despite the immense tonnage placed into it. For armaments, things are unsurprisingly simple. The Mackie has a right arm mounted AC-5 autocannon with 1 ton of ammunition, a left arm mounted prototype PPC, and a center torso mounted large laser. The MSK-6S, its next iteration, introduced around the same time as the Banshee, is nearly identical, save for it having 2 medium lasers in the center torso, replacing out the large laser and installing an experimental AC autocannon instead of the AC-5. For its day, in both of its primitive forms, the Mackie was truly a war winner. But its day just wasn't very long. To be trapped in this machine against almost any competent modern opponent is to be trapped in a tomb. The immediate successor to the Mackie for the HAF, the BNC-1E, first built and delivered to the HAF in 2445. Made by the same team, it is very much a next-generation attempt at general mech design. Still, one of the earliest mechs ever deployed, this machine brought many innovations to the role it was placed in, like fully articulating arms. Much like the Mackie, though, it has extremely primitive technologies overall, including a primitive cockpit, basic gyro, and basic internal structure. After this, to keep the mech running cool, which it mostly runs as, it has 16 single heat sinks. While it cannot alpha strike without overheating as a result, it can almost do so, and it would take several rounds of fire for it to begin to suffer the consequences for this. Getting into its mobility, the 1E has a 28.5-ton 345 primitive fusion engine, giving it a maximum speed of 54 km per hour, or 5 movement points in the tabletop game. This is not perfect, but for its era, it's not terrible. It's an assault mech, and it moves like one. For protection, it has an enormous 22.5 tons of primitive plating, giving it 240 points of armor overall. Primitive armor has many drawbacks, but at least it does have a lot of it. Once we get into its weaponry, we can see that it has 2 medium lasers mounted into the center torso, just like the original Mackie, as well as a small laser that is mounted into the head. In the left torso, it has an AC-5 autocannon, along with a standard PPC mounted in the opposite torso. This almost entirely mirrors the Mackie, save for the systems being torso mounted. However, it does have the advantage of having a full real PPC rather than an experimental prototype. Overall, it is very much the next step in mech evolution, but it is a clear successor to the Mackie from the very start. Hundreds of these were built on New Earth for a reason, and later thousands of its successor design, tragically. It's not peace through strength, but strength through peace that will be our motto. Director General Deborah Cameron to assembled nobles and political leaders, April 2509. Terra's place at the top of the military hierarchy of the Inner Sphere was by no means guaranteed during the latter portion of the 25th through to the 26th century, despite its monumental advantage in the craft and industrial output of war. There were economic consequences to Jacob Cameron's rule, and his rush towards acquiring the battle mech at all costs for the Hegemony armed forces. Jacob himself would go on to die in his early 60s from a stroke, before being succeeded by Theodore Cameron, his son. It appears that his heir was by no means the most restrained individual either. Despite banning functionally all opposition political parties with the collapse of the Terran Alliance, people still had the opportunity to vote on the heir designate when they were offered up to be the Director General. And Theodore did manage to secure his place as ruler, but there was a meaningful vote against him. 1 in 4 eligible voters, in fact, opted to not support his ascension to the title of dictator. They turned out to be largely correct, as Theodore, despite his military background, was a decadent ruler. Massive, expensive, and excessive highbrow events were what his rule was most renowned for. Outside of supporting the military's build-up, he proved to be negligent in the extreme, and he'd rather be engaging in horse races, extravagant balls, and wild parties said to be as debauched as those that came from the most infamous or famous points of human antiquity, myth, and legend. In fact, he used the public's purse to finance this, as well as to finance the construction or restoration of multiple palaces for himself and his family to enjoy. Regardless of showing some success in several conflicts, he, and later his daughter Elizabeth, who was an even worse example of dereliction of duty, jeopardized the Terran state's stability, leading to the near collapse of the Hegemony's government. But in this chaos, the military still found its budgets, and huge steps were made in quality regarding battle mech manufacturing. This era resulted in the beginning, it may be argued, of one of the most catastrophically irresponsible events of military and industrial waste in Terra's history as well. As during this time, where leaps and bounds were being made in battle mech technologies, the Hegemony did a massive refit program for several of their now slightly out-of-date designs, including the Banshee. In 2475, a new cutting-edge configuration of the Banshee was unveiled to the public. The BNC-3E, indeed, was a major upgrade over its prior design just on a technical level, but it was not a real, true upgrade. It housed a bigger, more powerful, and much more expensive engine for starters. This variant also used more sophisticated, less primitive armored plating, but it did almost nothing to advance the Banshee's weaponry. With battlemech technology spreading across the Inner Sphere by this point, and with new, cutting-edge, dangerous designs beginning to appear, the Terrans needed something that was not this incarnation of the Banshee, especially since it was even a step back from its predecessor in many ways, by simply being more expensive to manufacture due to its massive power plant. With their leadership being questionable, and with their industries being heavily locked in, the Hegemony doubled down on the BNC series. The Terran state built 5,000 Banshee BNC-3E battle mechs throughout the 25th and 26th century. The remaining BNC-1Es too were converted into this new, frontline fighting machine. The sad reality is that some military equipment throughout history has been more suited to be on parade than to be put into the field of battle. While the Banshee, when it was first introduced, was a perfectly capable machine, even a handful of decades later, after the introduction of the upgraded BNC-3E, it was horrifyingly obsolete. Thousands of these mechs were produced, however, where they were then put into direct confrontation with battlemechs like the WHM-6R Warhammer or the TDR-5S Thunderbolt. In fact, as border skirmishes and conflicts raged across the outer reaches of Terra's domain, it became increasingly obvious before the end of the 26th century, and even during the 25th century to some extent, that this mech was in fact a complete disaster. The face of the HAF, the mech that was their staple, was utterly hopeless, and when tested in real-world fighting conditions, it was tremendously underpowered. Intended to be a credible breakthrough mech, or assault mech, with close-range capabilities, doctrinally this mech was not going to be able to perform at all. It isn't even fully known when the battles took place that displayed the BNC-3E to be a complete paper tiger, but it would fall between one of three time periods. First, it could have been during the wars prior to the Reunification Wars, just due to the mech being clearly upstaged by vastly superior heavies, despite being heavier and more expensive. The second example would have been during the Reunification Wars themselves. Even when put up against forces comprised of a mixture of primitive and modern battle mechs with an over-reliance on primitive armor, the BNC would have been sorely tested in these conditions. The best evidence against this is ironically that so many Banshee chassis survived the Reunification War era to begin with. The third and final example would have been the years after the formation of the Star League, though this isn't particularly likely, as outside of hidden conflicts, military clashes were kept to a minimum. Regardless of when the Banshee was revealed to be wholly inadequate as a military asset, it changed the Hegemony armed forces drastically. They were forced to replace thousands of assault mechs with more competently designed machines. Even during these earlier times, by the end of the 26th century, this would have been a boon to the suppliers to the HAF and the newly formed SLDF. Mechs like the Highlander would become a major focus and center of attention during this process as the Banshee was receding from service. And recede it did. Dramatically so. Factories on Terra and New Earth ground to a halt after the Banshee had proven to be toothless. Its skull-like face, designed to cause fear in the enemies of Terra, was nothing short of a mockery now. While it did take several decades to wind down its production, this nonetheless did happen in its entirety. The last Banshees walked off their assembly lines, and these factories either changed ownership, were mothballed, or changed production runs in the wake of the mech's failure. There was no direct successor to the Banshee, in the way that the Banshee had been a successor to the Mackie. If anything, Terra and its new Star League were beginning to realize private ventures produced higher quality products over their mostly state-owned enterprise, and thus, there was no need for a sequel to the Banshee. The mech was tagged with being a bad government-produced weapon system, and little else. This one-time war-winning machine quickly found its way into training grounds and militia formations, but even then, there was still an abundance of these mechs. They weren't decommissioned, but instead were deployed to other states as well. All other great houses managed to acquire mechs from this surplus cache of 5,000 after the formation of the Star League. However, even they didn't use these things in frontline services, as why would you? Many medium mechs could outperform the Banshee at almost any role beyond taking enemy fire. Bullet catcher isn't a particularly popular role in any army, it turns out. So, the great houses, much like the Hegemony, use these for reserve formations at best, but often dump them onto training grounds. The Banshee was a mech that no one wanted. As a consequence, even after taking into account reserve forces, militias, and training grounds, thousands of Banshees were mothballed and stored away, rather than being outright destroyed for their parts. Likely, the reason for not just destroying these stocks for their parts probably fell to pride. Could the Terrans really have justified creating 50 regiments worth of mechs that were deemed useless? Destroying them in public for parts would have been an admission of negligence and incompetence. Instead, whatever couldn't be passed off was quietly put away. If the Star League never collapsed, likely the Banshee would have remained an obscure machine before entirely fading from the collective human consciousness. The Star League, however, was not something that lasted, and with its fall, the rules of war and the realities of war changed drastically. In spite of all of its problems, in spite of all of its shortcomings and failures, rising from the grave the Terrans had dug deep, the Banshee began to shriek while it emerged to see war in the inner sphere once more. First introduced in 2475 as a supposed assault mech, weighing in at 95 tons, the BNC-3E is the successor to the BNC-1E, and was envisioned as a frontline, up-close fighting machine. Shockingly incapable in its ability to take on this task, the BNC-3E, the first mainstream, non-primitive variant of the mech, and the most produced of its kind in recent history, is considered by history to be an abject failure. Let's discover why, while also going over some of the mech's virtues, as we look over this unique, though troubled design. Being one of the earliest adopters of intro tech, the 3E comes with a stock internal structure and gyro, and has a bonus over its predecessor, the 1E, by having a standard cockpit as well. This takes up a collective 16.5 tons of mass on board. After this, to keep the mech cool, and the 3E definitely runs cold indeed, it has 6 tons of heat sinks added, letting it once more vent 16 thermal buildup per turn. For its armaments, this is almost overkill, and many would consider it just that, given that one of its weapons will almost never fire with the other 2 primary systems. Still, sustainability in fire is a positive attribute, and oversinking isn't always disadvantageous. In regards to the mech's onboard electronic systems, the 3E comes with a DALBAN Comline communications package, as well as a DALBAN high-res B targeting and tracking system. Neither of these components offer the BNC any meaningful abilities beyond the normal function of the mech, however. To conclude the basic features of the mech, in the advanced rules, the BNC-3E suffers quite rightly from the poor reputation quirk, though latter variants of it would shed this reputation. And it also has the rugged trait, reflecting its durable and sturdy nature. While mobility is the most key asset of any mech realistically and determines the overall role a fighting machine may have, it is possible to overinvest in a single attribute, regardless of the tonnage bracket, and to acquire a poor outcome as a consequence. In the wake of the BNC-1E success, the designers opted to build on that, in improving the mech's mobility. Normally assault mechs can be quite sluggish, especially near the top of the weight curve. Instead of moving a lumbering 54 km per hour though, as most assault mechs in this bracket are assumed to, the bold decision was made to install an enormous and expensive 41-ton GM 380 Fusion standard engine. This gigantic power plant gives the Banshee the ability to run up to 64 km per hour, or 6 movement points in the tabletop game. It is also what condemned the Banshee to training fields, old military stocks, and rundown militia units, because it takes up so much weight on board the battle mech that it struggles to meaningfully function in any other way, and its mobility, while impressive for its size, is just the standard motion of a heavy and medium lance in the inner sphere even in the 26th century. This means it's not particularly agile even. It spends all of this weight on this very heavy frame in order to simply be normal. Giving up so much for to have a humongous engine, the Banshee must start paying the price in other spaces. While it is not poorly defended for the era of its construction, one which predates cases, anti-missile systems, or specialist armor types, the 3E nonetheless is not heavily guarded for its weight otherwise. Being covered in 15 tons of Star Shield standard, the BNC-3E has a total of 240 points of protection. Many mechs in this technology bracket, 15 to 20 tons lighter I should add, have the same volume of defense. Again, this is not bad. The Banshee is unlikely to be removed from battle in a single volley of enemy fire, but it is certainly not as impressive as its more famous, late-generation counterpart, the Atlas, which during the latter succession wars, it often was on the same battlefields as. To say that the Banshee is well-armed would be a fantastic lie. While the mech does sacrifice some protection to feed its gigantic onboard engine, most of the space to fit such an engine comes from its potential weaponry. Being less heavily armed than the 1E, the 3E, outside of its mobility, is in some ways a step down from its more primitive ancestor. To start with, in the right torso, the Banshee has a Magna Hellstar PPC. This strikes out to long distances, and can hole punch, though there won't be much of a follow-up to this system, because after this, the Banshee has an Imperator A AC-5 autocannon with 1 ton of ammunition mounted in its left torso. This means that the Banshee, a mech designed for close-range assaults, has 2 long-range weapons, which collectively do not do very much damage. The last system in its substandard arsenal is a head-mounted small laser. Though it is argued often that the Banshee's real threat is its ability to punch and kick in melee combat. The problem with this is, frankly, most competitors to this mech can make the same claims to fame, and simply have more weapons to show for it. Punches are a great add-on to an already competent assembly of weapons. The 3E just simply lacks in this respect. The BNC-3E was largely left to languish outside of serious military service for centuries for obvious reasons. Overcommitted to its extremely heavy, and I must reiterate, expensive engine, it drags down every other aspect of a perfectly serviceable chassis. From its defense being average instead of robust, and its firepower being extremely lacking, the massive 41-ton tragedy that lays at the core of this design simply steals too much of the productive capacity of the Banshee for it to be a viable battle mech. Though it must be noted that any mech can be dangerous under the right conditions. An arrogant adversary that allows the Banshee to kick their mech's legs off, or has a lucky series of strikes from its inadequate weapons land true, can make this mech stand out under the right conditions. But these circumstances are born of foolish enemies or pure luck. Sometimes it can find use being a sponge for enemy fire, while more powerful, or fragile, and useful assets within the unit are put into position. But the mech on its own has very few options on the battlefield. The reality is, under most fighting conditions, the Banshee 3E is a 95-ton casket. Unless fighting the tamest of opposition. The first true attempt to modify the Banshee into a more capable combat machine, the BNC-3M is a product of the Free Worlds League, debuting in 2579, clearly from the mechs the League had inherited from their Terran allies. The 3M is indeed a more reasonable, though flawed upgrade over the 3E. Retaining all of the 3E's core features, the only differences lay in the mech's firepower. First and foremost, the 3M restores the 1E's pair of medium lasers, giving the mech more close-range firepower. After this, it replaces out its AC-5 autocannon for a second PPC. This means that at long range, the 3M can lay down the same firepower as a Warhammer 6R, or around that of a MAD 3R, both of which are more than respectable in the field of firepower for this technology level. What is the problem? It has the same heat sinks as the MAD 3R. It simply can't handle the increased thermal output of firing its 2 PPCs routinely. So in essence, it turns the Banshee into a 95-ton Marauder that lacks its autocannon but retains its heat problem. The main advantage? No ammunition on board to detonate. And it is much more thickly armored than a MAD 3R. This means that the BNC-3M is a big step up from the 3E. But is it good? That's much more difficult to define. It is still challenged for a mech of its tonnage, but it's more credible than you might imagine. Don't underestimate this one on the intro tech battlefield. It might actually surprise you. I am a descendant of Shiro Kurita, who seized the right of rule and forged the Draconis Combine. In my veins runs the blood of the emperors of Japan, whose imperial house of Yamato is the oldest continuous hereditary monarchy of ancient Terra. What's more, my house alone tested the SLDF and showed the rot within the Star League. By what right do we rule? By the right of a heritage which spans 300 centuries. By the right of might that conquers and expands the glory of the realm. By the dictum honorium that elevates and ennobles all of the people under the dragon. Join that heritage. Join that legacy. Join that glory. And the Star League shall shine brighter than ever for millennia to come. This I swear. As of this day, the coordinator of the Draconis Combine shall also be addressed as First Lord of the Star League. Kurita Minoru, excerpts from Personal Address, 31st of December, 2786. The declining use of the Banshee during the Star League era was stark, which ironically is why the mech returned to prevalent usage during the years that followed. Why, may you ask? Because the Star League burned to the ground. The First Succession War officially started once Kurita Minoru unleashed hell by starting what Alexander Kerensky described as the Forever War, though no one house is completely to blame for the complete conflagration of destruction that was unleashed. 2786 was the beginning of a stark and horrible contraction for humanity. Houses Steiner and Marik had axes to grind, just as the Davions and Caridans. And that said nothing of rivalries with the Capellans, House Liao, who had developed icy relations with all of their neighbors as well. Even when factoring in these bitter regional rivalries, the disdain was such that major raids and sabotaging efforts would be unleashed from all of the great houses on one another with time as well. When the war was fully unleashed, it was as if the gates of hell were opened. The First Succession War saw untold destruction. Centuries of built-up military stockpiles were let loose by the great houses on one another. Whole ways of life were forced to change across the inner sphere, and that said nothing of major worlds that were damaged beyond salvaging. These now dead worlds, even near the core of humanity, were so thoroughly ruined by war that they were delisted from star charts. But how was this achieved? Clearly, it was not the mighty battle mech that depopulated whole planets. This is a correct assumption to make. The fires that ravaged the inner sphere came mostly from the heavens. Warships were the great killers of this first, catastrophic conflict. But they were far from the only killers, with the prolific use of nuclear weaponry also taking up its title as a major killer and bringer of devastation. More people were killed in this war than any other, though gradually, by the end of the First Succession War, these strikes from the skies subsided. This was not only due to a loss of an appetite to inflict this horror on one another, but it was also due to a decline in the capability to do so. Unfortunately for the sum total of humanity, key industries were deliberately targeted between states during the war, as well as the people who ran and understood those industries. While this was not, as of yet, completely unrecoverable, these aspects of the economy and vital industries had become severely degraded throughout the First Succession War. Just as a new normal seemed to be settling in after the fact, just as something appearing like peace began to form, another actor reignited these wars. Comstar, under Primus Conrad Toyama, Jerome Blake's successor and a holy figure to all who subscribed to the cult that truly ran the communications organization, radically believed that the inner sphere had yet to burn out the cancer that humanity had been so stricken with to end the Star League. So, it was they who stoked the Second Succession War in 2830. Their own objective was to finish the job the First War had started. Humanity's access to technology needed to be carefully managed and controlled, you see, and it was Comstar who decided who had what and when. They would preserve all knowledge needed for when mankind finally was ready for enlightenment. But until that point, they needed to discard their primitive and destructive ways. So Comstar, after igniting this war under the guise of another actor, then went on to murder just as many scientists and intellectuals as the rest of the Inner Sphere did, as the entirety of humanity descended once more into a complete bloodbath. This was the death blow for truly advanced technologies in human space. The last warships in the Inner Sphere, the harbingers of death from the First War, did not survive the conflict. Scientific and industrial centers were absolutely mutilated, either by the successor states trying to diminish one another, or by Comstar finishing anyone who was educated or knowledgeable enough to rebuild the wreckage of these husks into something more respectable. While not quite as many people died in the Second War, it was so wholly destructive that it changed humanity forever. Violence was the only language mankind now understood, ironically. The peace which the Blakeists wanted became less likely as human diplomacy and even governance became inherently more violence-oriented, even in the aftermath of the conflict. But most tellingly, it changed the nature of warfare too, with strategic weaponry now being viewed as taboo, and in many cases, such as warships, being impossible to build. It meant that fighting once more became even more grounded in the conventional. This sounds great, except for one key issue. The means of building advanced conventional armies, including battle mechs, also plummeted. A good example of this is endosteel, a key component in many advanced weapons and battle mechs. The Inner Sphere lost the means to construct this material. The space stations responsible for making it were destroyed or otherwise were lost. So this vital material simply vanished. That meant that the people who made LB autocannons, or built light mech frames, too, had to either change what they were building, or simply stopped. With time too, the LB autocannon as an idea just simply slipped away. Plans were lost by companies or they went bankrupt. And the people with know-how were never there to pass on this data to others. With the one exception, of course, being within Comstar, where these were all preserved. The loss of this one technology impacted mechs and tanks on multiple levels, having a knock-on effect, but other technologies were lost too. Gauss weaponry vanished. Advanced extra-light fusion engines? Lost. Higher capacity armor like ferrofibrous? Gone. Extended range energy weapons technologies, another victim of this degradation. It all eroded, and it wasn't just the systems themselves. Even battle mechs vanished during these two apocalyptic and tragic wars. The mechs which had come onto the scene after the Banshee had started to regress, like the Highlander for instance, became a rarity. No one could build the mech anymore. Eventually a refurbishing center and plant was established in the Capellan Confederation, but this couldn't build Highlanders. It could only restore Highlanders. But that meant this mech was barely in existence. It wasn't just advanced materials the mech may have used, it was the mech as a whole, becoming impossible to replicate. King crabs, night stars, black knights, catapults, and countless other designs all simply slipped into the sands of time, washing away in real time as militaries began shedding things they either could no longer repair or could no longer replace. Ironically, it is in this environment where the 5,000 stored away Banshees began to re-emerge. Mechs once thought to be a burden on the battlefield were now put back into service. At a certain point, it was just better to simply have a mech, rather than to have no mechs at all. And with there being literally thousands of these machines sitting in storage across the Inner Sphere, they began to show back up again as the glow from the nuclear fires of the first two succession wars began to dim. Even during those conflicts, it was not hard to imagine desperate or pressed commanders pushing these inadequate lumbering hulks into service. but it is truthfully the aftermath of the first two succession wars, where the Banshee's presence is once more truly felt. When the Banshee first appeared, mankind was filled with hope, even amongst the collapsed Terran Alliance and the Age of War that followed. The people who built it, and the Mackie before it, had envisioned a future where technology pressed ahead. The men and women who piloted these mighty machines into battle believed in their cause, and viewed themselves as being at the forefront of human security forces. It was a giant, standing above the battlefield, and it was enforcing a Terran-centric political establishment's rule across the stars. After the Second Succession War, the Banshee represented decline. The Mechwarriors who sat in its cockpit were sitting in a machine they did not respect, and were fighting for people who had dragged humanity hundreds of years into the past. Instead of fighting for something noble, at least in the minds of the pilots, they were fighting over the wreckage of what had once been an aspirational state and way of life. The house militaries had imploded into feudal, squabbling organizations. Only the best of the best units resembled anything respectable in the eyes of a soldier only a handful of years older. The Banshee was also a rejected piece of old junk, instead of a new wave of brilliant ideas packaged into the ultimate military force. The armies that fielded these machines now were desperate and starved, looking for anything that could even pretend to fight. The people who had piloted them, too, were steps down from generations prior. So yes, unlike before, the Banshee lingered over the haunted ruins that mankind had allowed their civilization to become. While competent, older variations of battlemechs managed to be saved in some way, with limited numbers of less capable mechs being produced annually. The capability for humans to wage war at all was dwindling. Many believed that the ability for mankind to even traverse the stars at all was to vanish with time, truly isolating humanity and leaving it to die in the cold depths of the night. And despite this, another war began to brew in the background. This war, however, was to be in truth a war of the survivors, a war of rats scurrying around the destruction that had been wrought in this once beautiful garden humanity had grown and curated. In 2866, only a handful of years after the conclusion of the Second Conflict, officially, the Third Succession War began. But this conflict was of a completely different nature than the prior two. So much had been destroyed in the prior wars. No one had any true hope of winning anymore. The new war was never on the same scale as the first two. The missions most sides launched against one another, either with their own forces or mercenaries, were in-depth or even surface-level raids, trying to scrape what few resources they could from others to amass more stability for themselves. Sometimes these attacks were done to simply acquire basic materials, and resources even, such as water. There were occasionally larger operations too, echoes of the military might that could be called upon from the past, but these were always fleeting. And the conflict of slowly grinding what was left of the inner sphere into dust simply continued along for over a century. Throughout the war, jump ships, the vessels that traverse the distance between the stars, could barely be repaired or built. This meant logistics chains for wars were always going to be complicated and broken. While planets changed hands, it was always just around the margins. Mankind had destroyed itself as its leaders squabbled over who was going to be the supposed leader of the long-dead Star League. Eventually, they were just fighting for survival, more than they were fighting for this faux goal. Worse, humanity by this point was fighting, perhaps because that was all it even knew now. This was the world the Banshee existed in. This was the kingdom that this ancient, dwindling titan ruled over, not because it was a grand war machine of note, but because it was one of the few war machines left to wage war with. In the wreckage and in the fire, the Banshee stood as the last mech standing in many respects, even if it was no longer being built at any type of scale. It was a miserable mech for a miserable era. But in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Inadequate, lacking in optimization, and treated with disdain by mech warriors of means, the rugged, centuries-old bodies of these failed mechs held against the darkness of the 3 succession wars by simply being amongst the mechs that were left. Though it should be noted that the bravery of those that took up the reins of these cursed juggernauts in this age of deterioration and savagery should never be brought into question. When raids landed on worlds in this skirmish-based series of wars, when people feared for their loved ones, property, and right to self-determination, whether in the hands of courageous militias, house units, or mercenaries, the BNC-3E was for many the last hope they had to survive, or to protect themselves in this despoiled and unforgiving environment. Perhaps this one-eyed figure best represents the era as a whole. Upon its scarred, overused, over-repaired frame, when one looks into the face pieced together by the Terran so many years prior, you could see the face of the Third Succession War. It best represents not only how foul it was, but also the grit, determination, and spirit that making it through a conflict alive in these times took. Great heroes aren't always the strongest, or the most powerful. Often, they are the ones who were there at the right time, and with the determination to make a difference. Regardless of its reputation, the Banshee in these wars is defined by that more than anything. Yet another heavily modified variant of the BNC-3 and BNC-3M. The BNC-3Q represents the last generation of Banshee configured in the image of the original design, created by an inner sphere power. Maintaining the 380 Fusion Standard engine, it still struggles with having enough weight for weaponry. This is yet another model implemented by the Free Worlds League during the late Succession Wars. The first of these units were assembled or converted in 2915, at the beginning of the 30th century. Also, ironically, the 3Q is also the variant of the Banshee that comes closest to performing its original job of being a close-quarters assault mech. Why is that, you may ask? Because the primary difference between this and its predecessor is that it is an actual close-range fighter. It has 2 weapons, a single small laser in the head, at this point something you should expect, and an AC-20 autocannon with 6 tons of ammunition. That's right, it's got 30 rounds of fire for its head-clipping, armor-smashing autocannon. It's a fat hunchback with no medium lasers. More ammunition, more armor, and more internal structure to chew through. So, what is there to say? It is a slab of armor with a cannon on it. It is an assault gun of a battle mech. If it gets worn down at a distance before it can reach its primary engagement zone, then it's in trouble. But it cannot be ignored. And if it gets its enemies in its sights, they will be punched and autocannoned to death. The 3Q knows what it wants to be, and while it may be outcompeted by other designs in this respect, it is very much a worry for someone else to come across. Even among us Steiners, there comes a time when cold-blooded practicality must outweigh even family loyalty. My uncle has proven his inability to rule. As his niece, I grieve for his disappointment. But I will not let my emotions stand in the way of what I feel is right. I am Archon now. That is what I feel is right for me. More importantly, that is what I feel is right for the Commonwealth. A royal court transcript of Archon Katrina Steiner in her announcement of Archon Alessandro's retirement. 3007. The darkness that had fully engulfed the inner sphere in technological decline and ignorance was not forever. A multitude of industrial and technological advancements were made or rediscovered, with the most remarkable being the discovery of the Helm Memory Core by the Grey Death Legion in 3028. The discovery of this data store, though, often overshadows the innovations that were being made in the inner sphere even before it was found. Much like a mass extinction event in a biosphere, eventually, nature begins to recover as the new normal is established. The Lyran Commonwealth was the economic power of the inner sphere ever since the collapse of the Terran Hegemony. Not only did it possess the vital military and industrial center that is Hesperus, their general economic and industrial prosperity, though dulled by the succession wars, could not be matched. Only the Free Worlds League held a candle to them. Prior to the collapse of the Star League as well, the Lyran state was considered to be a scientific hub, with a strong tradition being placed culturally on the sciences and higher education. This tradition was very much preserved through the decline of the succession wars as well, as evidenced by the fact that in the early 31st century, the Lyrans didn't just reconfigure mechs. For the first time in hundreds of years, they built new ones. The Merlin was co-developed by House Steiner, for instance. And that was just the first, because shortly afterwards, in cooperation with their future allies House Davion, they created another new chassis, the Hatchet Man. This also said nothing of the development of new, fusion-powered tanks like the Patton series, with Hesperus itself building a new fusion engine plant just to accommodate these vehicles. Frequently, those within advanced societies don't truly look at or appreciate the wonders that surround them, due to living in close proximity to them, and simply having the expectations that these services or products will always be there. Nations are their people, more than they are blobs on a map. The grand structures or machines countries produce are the products of generations of built-up knowledge and institutions. When the great houses engaged in the succession wars and annihilated their infrastructure, and deliberately targeted and killed the people capable of rebuilding it, it was nothing but a dream to reindustrialize in any meaningful way. Instead of simply wishing new technologies into existence on an idea, and then people making it a reality, any plans for a civilian or military product were restricted by the limitations that the state placed upon itself. The greatest contribution Katrina Steiner made to her people, to the nation she led, was her unwillingness to allow the decline to continue. The Hatchet Man, Merlin, Patton series of vehicles, and slightly later the Wolfhound, represented a concerted effort, in money and state-driven initiatives, to reclaim a fraction of what had been lost. In doing so, she not only produced new weapons for her armed forces, she truthfully enriched her people, and created the groundwork for greater prosperity to come later. We all stand upon the shoulders of the giants of the past, and this wisdom clearly drove the Commonwealth's foreign and domestic policies. These mechs and vehicles may not have used new technologies, but they represented new infrastructure, and an expansion of know-how and skills in the labor force and institutions. Institutions, infrastructure, and labor that the state and its military relied upon. With this in mind, House Steiner also embarked on one of the most ambitious projects of the late Third Succession War as well, when they opted to open a brand new mech assembly line, once more on Hesperus, and this time for an assault mech. Building a whole new battle mech, like the Merlin or Hatchet Man, would be extremely expensive, even for the Lyrans. But re-engineering an old design, one which was still rugged and reliable, that was still a major project, and still represented a huge leap forward, but the cost of working on something tried and tested is often substantially less than building something wholly new. The Banshee was the target of Defiance Industries to make this new lord of the battlefield. With a fully mapped out chassis in terms of its myomers and well understood general mech functions, the BNC series was the perfect fit, in theory, for this new plan. Reverse engineering the mech schematics would be necessary at this point, though Defiance does appear to have had copies of Terra's old fabrication processes. Building and tooling a manufacturing line is an arduous and intensely expensive task, even with the ability to work backwards from a completed product. But the Lyrans had zero intention of simply building the BNC-3E or even 3M. No, they had far greater plans, and those involved first and foremost tackling the biggest issue holding this steel titan back. They did the very thing the Terrans should have done centuries prior, and downgraded the enormous engine on board to the common and reliable Pitman 285. With an engine less than half the size of the originals, the Banshee could not run as fast as it once did, but it finally had a reason to charge ahead into battle. Other major changes were made, rebuilding the left arm and removing the hand and replacing it with a devastating energy system, all while installing an arsenal of other vicious weapons too. What the Lyrans had by the end of this process is considered by many to rival the Atlas in its fighting capability. Some even go further, claiming that it is the peak assault mech of the intro tech variety. No longer was the Banshee a hidden-away substandard piece of equipment, acting as a militia mech, or as a part of the forces of the desperate. These brand new steel behemoths walked off the assembly line in 3025 for the first time. And as they did, they marched into the frontline formations of the Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces. The material advantage they now offered was apparent to anyone who cast a glance in their direction, though their service record too, from the onset, was fantastic. In its first recorded engagement, a prototype BNC-3S in 3026 met Justin's Grenadiers during an attempted raid by the Capellan Confederation on New Earth. Their assault went horribly wrong, as they faced unexpected resistance in the form of the 12th Donegal Guards. One Lieutenant Robin King, the pilot of this new powerhouse, proved just how dangerous this modern mech could be. The Grenadiers were stunned at the raw firepower that they were confronted by, and saw their forces smashed, with a full lance of medium and heavy mechs alone being lost directly to the new assault. This level of destruction was only the start. When Defiance Industries' production lines began to fire up, producing these revitalized monsters, the politics of the Inner Sphere shifted wildly. No longer were the Federated Sons and Lyran Commonwealth mere trading partners. They would unite into one realm. This would have far-reaching consequences, as well as very immediate ones. Catherine Steiner arranged a marriage between her daughter, Melissa, and one Hans Davion. Katrina Steiner had proposed a cessation to hostilities and an end of the succession wars only a few years prior, but no House Lords agreed to such a plan, though an inquiry was at least made by House Davion. This, through negotiations, evolved with time into an alliance, and then a union. It clearly set a line across the Inner Sphere between two grand alliances. The Federated Commonwealth, the union of Houses Steiner and Davion, versus the Concord of Captian, made up of House Marik, Liao, and Karita. The former was unified, and the latter was decentralized. A fourth succession war was to engulf mankind once more in a storm of violence. And this new conflict, a two-sided war, changed the borders of the great houses of the Inner Sphere more than any since the first. Much of the conflict wasn't driven by Steiner's political ambitions necessarily, though they had their own grudges to settle. In reality, this fight was driven by the political ambitions of Hans Davion. Hans was much more the warrior than any of his Steiner peers, and that included his young bride. He had his forces preparing for years to make a decisive, unstoppable push into the Capellan Confederation. Intent on acquiring revenge for the Confederation's attempt to replace Hans with a body double in order to politically capture the Federated Sons, Maximilian Liao had unknowingly sowed the wind, which meant he and his nation would be forced to reap the whirlwind. Wife, in honor of our marriage, in addition to this morsel, I give you a vast prize. My love, I give you the Capellan Confederation. Hence Davion's proclamation during his wedding, Terra, 3028. The latest innovations of the Lyran Commonwealth cut their teeth truly in this inferno along their borders. However, it is important to note that the fighting in the war of the most consequence was between 4 other entities: the Federated Sons, the Capellan Confederation, the Draconis Combine, and the Wolf's Dragoons. House Steiner all the same did play a vital role in many ways. Economic support of their Davion allies, who traditionally lacked in the realm of commerce and industry, was vital, though there were also significant military efforts as well. This wasn't a one-way street either. Davion military advisors had helped the LCAF refine new techniques, though the quality of Steiner leadership in battle amongst state-owned formations has always been questionable. The Steiners' great contribution to the fighting took on the form of Operation Gotterdammerung, with their invasion of the Draconis Combine. Originally meant to be part of a much larger operation against the Combine, where Davion would be assaulting from the other side, Gotterdammerung was still very effective overall in spite of this. Over the several years of battle, multiple worlds changed hands, and most in the Commonwealth's favor. Had the Combine not been fighting the Wolf's Dragoons in a pointless vendetta, or being isolated, still fighting the relatively distracted House Davion, these offensives likely would have been nowhere near as successful. Another offensive opened up against the Dragon shortly after, and despite the Free Worlds League counterattacking successfully in several places along the front, they were bluffed into conceding their gains from their campaign. By the end of the war, the Inner Sphere had been reshaped in ways that few could have ever imagined only a decade earlier. Huge numbers of worlds exchanged hands. The entire central corridor of the Inner Sphere was now a bridge between houses Steiner and Davion. The Concord had been rebuked. The Capellan Confederation and Draconis Combine suffered most during the war, taking on the lion's share of the losses, with the Confederation being particularly badly mauled, losing seemingly half of its some territories, and much of its industrial heartland. This turned it into a rump state, even after they were already the sick man of the Inner Sphere. At the spear's tip of the Steiners' victories throughout the campaign were the new designs that revitalized the military forces involved. Mechs like the Banshee, Wolfhound, and other new marvels overwhelmed their battle-tested adversaries on the field. And with the logistics support of the greatest economy in the Inner Sphere, they were able to achieve grand victories. Despite setbacks, which the Steiners suffered as well of course, they had played their role. Moreover, House Steiner didn't need a victory on the same scale as Hans's grand success against the Confederation. They simply needed to hold the line and apply pressure, which they achieved masterfully. For their efforts, and with Hans Davion staying as true to his word as possible, he gifted Melissa Steiner the newly established Sarna March, after the cessation of hostilities in 3030. Standing victorious over their enemies, the new Federated Commonwealth, with the military of House Davion and the economy of House Steiner, seemed set not only to continue to succeed, but to restore the Star League in their own image even. That image, one may argue, might have been a legion of Banshees and other immense monstrosities coming out of Steiner factories, striding towards their lesser adversaries. The mech that changed the entire perception of the Banshee series of battle mech The Banshee-3S is a monster made manifest. While it is a massive departure from the original, it is not as wholly changed as one might imagine, even if its fighting potential is vastly superior to its forebears. A true terror to behold. This Lyran-forged beast from 3025 is perhaps the deadliest inner sphere intro tech assault mech, or at the very least is in contention to be ranked as such. Considered a peer or superior to the likes of the Atlas, King Crab, and others, it has truly left a mark on battlemech design as a whole. To see why though, let us break down this Titan's components. Using the second most basic technologies, the 3S comes with a standard internal structure, gyro, and cockpit, the same as the 3E even, as no adjustments can be made here with the available technologies of the day. Where things start to diverge is in its greater and needed emphasis on cooling, with the mech having a total of 11 additional tons of standard heatsinks installed, raising its cooling value to 21 per turn. This is absolutely a necessity given the extremely heavy firepower the 3S has on board. Even with this significant share of its weight massed towards this feature, it's important to note that the Banshee can definitely still struggle to stay cool. On the electronics front, the 3S is equipped with the same equipment as the 3E, in the form of a Dalban Comline communications package and a Dalban Hi-Res B targeting and tracking system. Unsurprisingly, these did not give the BNC-3E any boost in performance, and they don't give the 3S one either. Finally, as to quirks, the 3S has the rugged trait. This may sound shocking, but if you need to free up weight in a mech that has a gigantic engine, the best way to acquire said volume is to reduce the size of the engine, which is exactly what Lyran engineers did when they tackled this historic project. Downgrading from the prior 41-ton 380 fusion power plant, the BNC-3S instead opts for the much more conservative 16.5-ton Pitband 285 fusion standard engine. This does indeed drop the Banshee's speed down to 54 km per hour instead of 64, reducing it to 5 movement points in the tabletop game. There is a knock-on effect to this beyond saving weight, in other words. It is harder for the 3S to generate defensive bonuses, and rough terrain can prove to be more of an obstacle as a result. But there is a small trade-off, as you can imagine, in the form of it freeing up 24.5 tons of weight for functional and useful things, such as weaponry. In essence, there is always going to be an exchange when taking from one area and giving to another. But in the case of the 3S, with its role as that of an assault mech, this rebalancing is easily worth it, given the intended fighting role of the mech. Interestingly, where things don't change for the Banshee is in its armored protection. The 3S has the exact same outfitting as the prior model, with 15 tons of standard plating. This is fine, though it does open the mech to being less defended than machines like the Atlas, or even the King Crab, who are relatively close competitors. It's also important to note that while it is still relatively well armored, it has 3 tons of ammunition on board, meaning that it can be critically struck where these things are contained, which will immediately, typically, destroy the mech. Also, for an assault mech of its size, it is armored like an 80-ton mech, which is fine for an awesome, but it is 95 tons, and it is slower than prior models. Designers felt that this wouldn't be an issue, and it largely isn't. But it can have an impact on the Banshee's battlefield sustainability if it attracts too much fire too early. Unsurprisingly, the greatest changes to the Banshee are in the realm of offense. It makes sense, given that the mech being undergunned was clearly the greatest thing holding back the entire series. How Steiner solved this more than adequately. However, it is noteworthy that the mech largely follows the original weapon's plans, and just expands outwards. The original right torso mounted Magna Hellstar PPC is retained, as well as a head-mounted Magna Mark I small laser. The original Imperator AC-5 autocannon in the left torso is upgraded to an Imperator B AC-10 class autocannon instead. The new cannon also has 2 tons of ammunition, so it matches the original number of rounds the first gun could fire as well. After this, more extensive changes begin. Its left hand is replaced to accommodate an additional PPC, though it is a Donnell branded cannon. Then, 4 Magna Mark II medium lasers are installed into the right torso, with an additional small laser being fixed into the center torso as well. And as the final piece of the puzzle, it has a Harpoon 6 SRM launcher with 1 ton of ammunition. This is also found in the right torso. In totality, this is an immense shift in firepower, especially if it is bracketed wisely. In terms of long and medium ranges, its particle cannons and AC-10 will decimate targets with the ferocity of an awesome, and with a very similar heat profile to one as well. When things get in close, it typically will drop the PPC fire in favor of firing its medium lasers, missiles, and once more its autocannon, shredding targets, and once more doing so without badly overheating. In close, it's a monster, but at a distance, it's still a monster. It is very well gunned for its era, and even would have teeth by the standards of later eras, because it is so well configured. How Steiner found a true war-winning combination with the BNC-3S. As far as assault mechs go, it is one of the most dangerous intro tech designs ever constructed. Fighting at range like an awesome, and fighting in close with the ferocity of a battlemaster, it is a true challenge for anyone who stumbles across it. However, it is not without its shortcomings. If not bracketed appropriately, it will overheat dramatically. And most notably, despite being relatively well guarded, it isn't in the context of its tonnage overall, which can make it vulnerable to some extent to heavy enemy fire, which it will face, especially with ammunition in both side torsos. Overall, if used wisely, if employed with cunning and an understanding of its devastating weapons package, the Banshee 3S will rule over any battlefield it's placed within. It truly is a phoenix, rising from the ashes, reborn and restored into a new, powerful form. One which serves its Lyran masters well. You'd trust a nation of shopkeepers to organize an operation on this scale? I wouldn't trust them with a picnic. Anonymous Infantryman, 4th Crucius Lancers. In the years after the wild success of the Fourth Succession War for the Steiner-Davion alliance, turbulent stellar political realities began to make their presence known, and the newly formed Federated Commonwealth sought to assert its dominance over the whole of the Inner Sphere. The victors of the Fourth Succession War became infected by their outstanding success, and the wild ambitions of the now unified families at the top of these states proved too great even for this grand alliance to handle. The Capellan Confederation had been the first victim of this new alliance. However, the Draconis Combine was the real prize to seize, as it represented the largest military force outside of the newly formed Federated Commonwealth itself. There was also, unsurprisingly, immense bad blood between Karita and both Steiner and Davion, for a near immeasurable number of grievances. A new war was, at this point, being considered by the Steiners and Davions. This new conflict was to be the decisive victory for the Alliance, and a step towards the overall control and hegemony of the entirety of the Inner Sphere. There was only one problem with this ambition, though. Namely, being the Concord of Captian had another, hidden ally, who was seeing to it that this did not take place. Comstar. Between support from the Free Worlds League and the quiet hidden support from Comstar, the Draconis Combine had recovered largely from their setbacks in the Fourth Succession War. And in more ways than one might imagine. The formation of the Free Rosselhag Republic, a clever strategic move by House Karita and Comstar, also created a new buffer state which almost cut the overall border with Steiner and Davion in half. This allowed for the Dragon to better shift their forces on the immense unified border it now had to defend from their allied opposition. It also had another fascinating benefit to House Karita and Comstar as well, as this act caused substantial unrest inside of the borders of their deadly enemies. By allowing the Republic to secede and become the master of its own destiny, in theory, it politically forced the Lyrans to cede worlds to them as well, drawing from several regions within the victories of the Fourth Succession War, and now other provinces began to make their own plays for independence. All of the great powers of the Inner Sphere knew the broader war had only taken a pause, rather than ending permanently. Everyone was now putting together their ploys to achieve a final victory or decisive blow. One of the biggest advantages the Federated Commonwealth had possessed during the Fourth Succession War was a series of new configurations and battle mechs being at their disposals. In the years after the humiliation delivered to them by the Wolf's Dragoons and House Steiner Davion, the Dragon learned from their enemies, as well as their own errors, and sought to remedy this shortcoming with new innovative designs, as well as caches of ancient Star League mechs that had not been seen consistently in generations. These ancient and sophisticated designs appeared as a result of Comstar's generosity towards them. The BNC-3S was still the premier fighting machine of the era for the LCAF, which was still functionally its own military entity despite the newly formed alliance with Davion. The machine by the end of the 3030s had been produced for approximately 15 years, and had an excellent reputation amongst its pilots. While many would look upon the Banshee with derision in the centuries before, this had indeed started to change. Other houses still used the Banshee in its traditional form, but the Lyrans were gradually producing and deploying more and more of their own monstrous variant. This reflected, in many ways, the material evolution of the Steiner military as a whole. No great house in the first half of the 31st century could match the Steiners on almost any level in terms of the quality of their equipment, or in the realm of their support for their soldiers in the field, at least in theory. The real problem for the LCAF, and later their half of the AFFC, mostly revolved around the quality of the soldiery of those within the army. While many may argue that the condition of their troops on the ground was always high, and it was instead the corrupt, high-ranking officer class that held back the armies of House Steiner, this is not wholly the case. House Steiner is no stranger to military success, but frequently it has been factors outside of their military competency that have played into their achievements. The War of 3039, and sadly later conflicts, only proved how true this was. After the full integration of the AFFS and LCAF, it is more than telling that most of the military ranks and structure favored the Federated Sons doctrines, not the Lyran ones. Gathering their forces on the Combine border, Steiner and Davion, unable to conceal their play to knock out the Combine as a major power, prepared for the war they'd dreamt of, originally planned for 3035, but delayed due to economic and internal issues. In 3039, things seemed ripe for their opportunity to strike. The alliance required legitimacy, however, as it was decided that a true pretext for war was required, rather than just them invading on the whims of their leadership. This was gifted to them eventually with the repression of former Davion citizens on a series of worlds taken by the Combine during the Fourth Succession War. This gave them the justification, a casus belli, for their invasion. On April 16th, the Davion-Steiner alliance unleashed hell as they invaded several systems to begin their master plan of cementing their grip on the Inner Sphere. A brutal series of blows landed on the Davion military district, with the Combine losing in fantastically quick fashion, much as the Steiner Davions had imagined. Combine counterattacks in this early stage of the conflict struck with no impact, and local garrisons and DCMS troops were simply swept aside by the exceptionally well-led AFFS and LCAF juggernauts. What they did not realize was that the dragon had been anticipating their moves and strikes, and while the local commander, Noketsuna, did his best, he knew no aid was coming from Luthien, at least not yet. The invasion was even larger than the DCMS had anticipated. It was also sophisticated, broad, and coordinated. At least to the Cretan's perspective, there was little that they could do as a legion of Commonwealth mechs tread over their forces. The Combine's command structure buckled under their requests for aid and attempts to allocate their forces, even according to their plans. The situation was beyond perilous. Had it not been for the Gunji no Kanri, Karita Theodore, perhaps the dragon would have been slain. But instead, by May, the situation was beginning to be addressed by the very capable Lord of War that the Combine now had. The Steiner-Davion alliance simply hadn't seen the full breadth of what was yet to come. The invasion paid off politically, initially, for the new Commonwealth, and victory seemed assured. By the end of the first wildly successful wave in July, despite several small missteps, the Federated Commonwealth seemed poised to truly do as they intended, reshape the entire inner sphere to their whims. On their front lines, their battle mechs, like the Banshee, crushed any resistance they faced. Often, armor like the BNC-3S would be squaring off against inferior machines at this stage, in both design and weight, like the Panther or other similarly outclassed machines. While the DCMS also deployed very capable mechs, such as the Atlas, or the new Hatamoto Chi, or the recently restored Thug, it had nowhere near the volume of these assets to match the Steiners, let alone the Davions on the field, mech for mech, at least in the opening engagement. May the dear Lord have mercy on those unfortunate enough to get in our way, because we won't. Lieutenant General Sharon Zardetto. The war continued, and with their successes so far, the next stage of the plan was to consolidate, and to finalize their gains in the Davion military district as well as elsewhere. After this, they were to balloon out their footholds, squeezing out the DCMS before thrusts drove further into the heart of the beast they sought to slay. The primary strike from the Lyran Commonwealth was viewed as the weakest by the Combine despite its impressive arsenal. Kathleen Heaney, the overall theater commander, had opted to, after the initial success of the invasion, utilize the Lyran strategic doctrine of simply crushing her opponents under the might of the LCAF's manpower and armor. This made for the worst outcome, as they quickly found full-scale DCMS counterstrikes ripping into their positions across most of their gains. This particular big arrow, known as Operation Winter Snow officially, was put into extreme distress. It only became worse when one General Nondi Steiner became severely injured, as she was the on-field commander for the operation, because afterwards her less capable subordinates had to take command, who then only exaggerated how poorly the Steiners were to perform in this region. In other areas, such as the planet Vega and much of the rest of the war zone, further counterattacks were launched, striking into the aggressors there too, with only the AFFS proving to be able to have the grit to withstand the anticipated DCMS assault. As the Steiner Davions had expected a major counterblow at this stage, the real tragedy for the LCAF is that they were struggling to weather it. More disastrously for the Alliance still, their second attack into Davion had continued, but at the loss of much of Wave 1's worlds being retaken by the Combine, twisting the invasion into an almost nightmarish scenario for the Federated Commonwealth. The second Wave 2 suffered severely during the counterattack period, as while they'd anticipated attacks in the previous region, they'd been stunned when their new offensives met counteroffensives out of the gate as well, shocking their assault and grinding it to a halt. As if all of that wasn't bad enough, The Draconis March itself, a Davion province, became threatened by the Combine troops shortly afterwards, showing a potential collapse of the entirety of the border region of the Federated Suns as several worlds fell. This proved to be too much for the Steiners and Davions to weather. The DCMS had gambled, in truth, with such an aggressive strategy, repositioning troops and expending almost all of their reserves to achieve their success. Had the war continued much on from this point, they'd have been shown to be exhausted. However, Hans Davion, seeing the utter failure of the front line, seeing almost all of their advances vanish, and seeing Steiner's inability to function properly in the campaign, called to a halt of the fighting. Shortly thereafter, the invasion came to an end, though not before 5 more months of grueling combat took place. In spite of being a draw, the war was a resounding setback. Even with the borders being mostly stabilized, it showed the new alliance was not invincible, and worse, it showed all of the flaws in their military tactics and doctrines. They had overtaken 4 worlds, but they'd anticipated taking 40, and they'd lost another world to the League on the border as well, as the Combine's allies did make some moves to give them the aid they could justify, without causing a full-blown war on another border, which meant that the Federated Commonwealth took a total of 3 worlds when the scales were balanced. It was hardly the glorious conquest they'd hoped for. The operation to neutralize the threat of the Draconis Combine has developed contrary to our predictions, and with the assault by the DCMS troops into the Draconis March, we must suspend further offensive operations until said threat can be neutralized. Prince Hans Davion's Recall Order, 3039. There was another factor behind all of the uncertainty in the wake of the setback as well. With so many Comstar-provided mechs showing up in the Combine's military, many of the Davion and Steiner commanders not only fought mechs they didn't fully understand or know, they were also engaged in battles with many mechs that possessed Star League-era technologies. While the Helm memory core had been rediscovered, to see large-scale employments of these machines at scale was more than jarring, and many speculated on just how advanced the Combine's technology had progressed. Even impressive war machines like the BNC-3S were comparatively primitive to an SLDF-era thug, or an assortment of other dangerous and deadly battle mechs that had fallen into the hands of the Dragon. This put the LCAF's hardware supremacy to the test, especially as more and more of these mechs appeared throughout the course of the invasion. Warfare had changed. The dynamics that allowed for the brilliant success of the Forced Succession War no longer existed. Increasingly sophisticated and heavily armed battle mechs were to be where the great powers pivoted to next. With the rediscovery of most of the Star League's military technologies through the Helm memory core, or through technology transfers from Comstar, the advanced nature of the newly constructed mechs within the Great Houses dramatically rose over the coming years. This was unlike the last 3 centuries of brutal warfare in the Inner Sphere, where things largely stayed the same outside of the figures involved, as there was now an arms race to be won. Stronger, faster, and with more refinement, a new era of battle mechs were upon them. The War of 3039 offered a glimpse into what was to come. The defense industries of the Federated Commonwealth most certainly recognized this for themselves, and began multiple projects to drive this home. Once more, new facilities were built, industries roared to life, and the new battle mechs that emerged from them in this process would be deadlier than before. Older machines, more so than just new ones, were also a part of this renaissance of technology, and the Federated Commonwealth strove for their armed forces to roll out refits of ancient designs, including, of course, of the Banshee. Having been rebuilt into a monster once in 3025, a new Banshee was on the horizon now too, one which was a true revolution in assault mech warfare. and one that came just in time. Because another threat emerged from beyond the outer reaches of the periphery, one which changed the inner sphere forever. Conceived and produced in 3037, the BNC-3MC was a reinvention in the periphery of the aging and obsolete BNC-3E model, hoping to get more life out of this aging chassis, especially in a region where expensive refits and advanced technologies were uncommon to say the least. The MC represents trying to make a bad idea work. While superior to the original, and it is acceptable as a periphery mech, it's still not particularly impressive. Very little changes in the MC compared to the 3E, save for the fact it removes 4 heat sinks on board and upgrades its AC-5 autocannon to an AC-10 autocannon, with 2 tons of ammunition. This gives the mech more of a bite, but it causes it to have cooling issues overall. More firepower is never a bad thing in the context of these old mechs, however, and it is overall a significant step up. It's just a 95-ton assault mech, with very limited options overall, even compared to mechs 20 tons lighter than it. The clan invasion gave many warriors the chance to be a hero in the eyes of their people. Sadly, many of the Inner Sphere's heroes achieved their notoriety posthumously, often fighting a desperate delay action in the face of a seemingly unstoppable clan juggernaut. For the few who were lucky or good enough to not only survive, but to achieve some modicum of victory, such as the likes of Kai Allard Liao on Twycross, legends were born. Ludwig von Niederhausen. Excerpt from Dark Times, The Clan Invasion, Avalon Press, 3075. A fifth devastating succession war appeared to be on the horizon on the march to the year 3050. The Captian Accord and Federated Commonwealth seemed destined to wage a new conflict against one another, and the outcomes for all sides were hardly assured. Over the 10 years that had passed since the War of 39, the Inner Sphere had developed significantly in regards to military innovations. More and more cutting-edge, Star League tech designs were finding their way into the general ranks of all of the armies of the Inner Sphere. Most major military formations were still composed of intro-tech battle mechs and equipment, barring elite units or small portions of larger assemblies of equipment. But this process of upgrade and redistribution was a vital effort by the Federated Commonwealth in the run-up to a potential new engagement with its now bitter rivals. Additionally and vitally, reforms to the military of the Federated Commonwealth resulted in the AFFC, or the Armed Forces of the Federated Commonwealth. The transfer of military traditions, organization, tactics, and general knowledge enhanced the military capabilities of the unified state in dramatic ways as well, though it had yet to be fully tested. And it was most definitely about to be. Damn straight it's quiet out there. Those pirates know damn well not to mess with us anymore. Hauptmann General Frederick Anderson, prior to the clan invasion. Operation Revival, as the clans called it, began months before the Inner Sphere recognized it, with the invasion and destruction of the Oberon Confederation, as well as various micro-periphery states, in the designated corridor the clans had opted to attack through. Arrogantly, the Inner Sphere powers, as piracy actively ceased, and as a wall of silence descended from this region, simply assumed that those beyond their borders had finally stopped their predatory and self-serving activities. This was the embodiment of hubris on behalf of the Inner Sphere powers, especially regarding their military intelligence. The official start date for the invasion according to the Inner Sphere was March of 3050, and for the Federated Commonwealth, their primary adversary was to be one of the most infamous military organizations in the history of mankind, that being Clan Jade Falcon. The assault was unlike anything the Inner Sphere had experienced since the fall of the Star League. While clan military doctrine outside of very direct engagements left a lot to be desired, clan Mechwarriors were often fearless individuals who were extremely disciplined, and their military technology was more often than not centuries beyond what the Inner Sphere could hope to field in opposition. House military units across all of the defending powers, namely the Free Rossalike Republic, Draconis Combine, and Federated Commonwealth, were caught entirely ill-prepared, and with no game plan to address the problem. In the month of March alone, collectively the three powers lost 30 worlds to various clan opponents. Kerensky's children had returned, the descendants of the SLDF, and with them they did not bring the salvation so many yearned for in the war-ravaged Inner Sphere, but instead chaos, wrath, and a nightmarish society even fouler than the primitive state the human sphere had descended into. From the moment their invasion began, the very existence of the long-standing nations of the Inner Sphere was put into question. On the front lines, the defenders were overwhelmed, being forced into shameful surrender, destruction, or flight. There seemed to be almost no hope against the clans and their legendary, deadly machines like the Timberwolf, Nova, Summoner, and an assortment of others. Militarily and politically, there had to be a response. The great houses, particularly Steiner, Davion, and Karita, set aside their differences to combat this new threat. More refits were put into production. In addition, cutting-edge battle mechs, like the Gunslinger, were designed throughout the invasion, purpose-built to stop the clan's deadly war machines in their tracks. Very few of these variations of equipment came into production during the conflict itself, however. Between the invasion of the Periphery in 3049 and the Battle of Tukiad in 3052, only the Comguards fielded large numbers of advanced, purpose-built machinery to bring down the clan's steel Goliaths. By the end of the invasion, a great swathe of worlds had been claimed by the clans. A few campaign battles on the Lyran front had proven that there was still the ability to fight back for the spheroids. Somerset and Twycross were victories, and ones which cemented the clans could be bested on the battlefield. But these examples were fleeting. During the fierce fighting that took place in this hellish campaign, the Banshee was a notable standout, even in its 3S configuration. Being able to trade blows with the clans as they invaded, this mech would have been a bulwark to lean against for any of the defenders in the Federated Commonwealth. Sadly, its slow gait, and some of the machine's other limitations, heavily hindered its ability to truly fight off the invaders of the Commonwealth. Its Falcon opposition, and some of the Wolves as well, were too much for this powerful machine to handle, or really any other Lyran unit to handle. Even the mightiest of the Inner Sphere's battle mechs were swept aside, including, sadly, the Banshee. But during the invasion itself, a new design had been put forward in 3050. Such major upgrades are rarely done on the fly, meaning a retrofit had to be in the works for some time. But a new variant, the BNC-5S, was what the Federated Commonwealth needed to fight an invasion such as this. Subtle tweaks to the 3S, and the utilization of advanced Star League-era technologies, made the proposed 5S one of the first true battle mechs that could be quantified as a clan buster. A major feature of this biped that made this a reality was the reintroduction of extra-light fusion engines. Why specifically in this case? Because the 5S is truly an evolution of what the Banshee was meant to be. It combines the philosophy of the original intention of the more mobile BNC-1E and BNC-3E, with the revolutionary shift towards raw firepower of the BNC-3S. In essence, it moves at the pace of the 3E and has the devastating firepower of the 3S, if not more. While mainline production variants did not reach the front during the primary invasion years, it is unknown if any prototype models did so. Regardless, the BNC-5S was to be a very rude awakening for their clan adversaries when it truly emerged in 3053, and it arrived just in time, in numbers, to partake in some of the hardest fighting seen by the armies of the Great Houses. Raids took place along the borders between the Falcons and the Federated Commonwealth during the truce period after the Battle of Tukiad. Metal was tested against metal in the arms race across the Inner Sphere, and the 5S eclipsed its more primitive counterparts in terms of priority by this time. In fact, the 3S was gradually phased out, starting with the arrival of the 5S, with it being placed on patrols to fight pirates and minor periphery states, instead of more dangerous security theaters. But the first true test for the 5S, and for its new political masters, came in 3058, during the era of the clan invasion, and still against clan opponents. The world had changed dramatically since the invasion had started, but most of all in the Federated Commonwealth. Hence Davion had died of a massive heart attack, mostly caused by stress induced by military and political events. Melissa Steiner, his wife, was then assassinated by their power-hungry daughter, Catherine Steiner Davion, though she wasn't implicated in the murder at the time. Victor Steiner Davion, the eldest child of Hans and Melissa, reigned as the Archon Prince for only 2 years before his sister, Catherine, ripped the nation in two by taking power in what she now called the Lyran Alliance. Catherine's rise to power at first was welcomed, but it came about due to her exploiting uncertainties and resentment amongst the Lyran people over how disastrously things had unfolded for the Lyran half of the Commonwealth since the clans arrived. Manufacturing the political realities she needed, and exploiting what grievances she could, Catherine ruthlessly pushed towards having more power for herself at almost every opportunity. The last piece that came together for her to take the throne was when Joshua Marik, the son of Captain General Thomas Hallis, the false Thomas Marik, died on New Avalon, with the death being covered up by Victor. This caused Operation Guerrero, an assault by the Free Worlds League and Capellan Confederation, which tore into the link between the two states that made up the unified Commonwealth. With the support of the Lyran half of the military and intelligence services, Catherine was ushered into power, and began immediately attempting to purge subversive elements to her rule. With political chaos across the Inner Sphere, particularly in the newly formed region known as the Chaos March, and with turmoil and animosity between the two former halves of the unified Federated Commonwealth, an attack that functionally broke the Truce of Tukiad was unleashed by the Jade Falcons. Martha Pride, herself a recent ascendant leader of her people, was overseeing the reconstruction of the badly mauled Jade Falcon Tumen in the aftermath of the refusal war with Clan Wolf. The Falcons needed to prove that they were still a force to be reckoned with, and their pride had been slighted for the last time. Unable and unwilling to strike out against the Wolves in an ultimately self-defeating effort, Khan Pride opted to turn her attention once more to the Inner Sphere. I am content to let them choose which units to send here, Commander. We are at the truce line. They know they must stop us here, or the war will begin anew, and they will have to face all the clans. Their troops are doubtlessly already on their way. They will be some of their best units, too. We break them, and in doing so, break the spirit of the Lyran Alliance. And once we have done that, none will doubt the Jade Falcons, nor will they prevent us from taking whatever we desire. Martha Pride, discussing her plans. Coventry, 3058. On January 30th, 3058, after mustering her forces throughout 3057, the Falcon's talons were unleashed upon the unprepared, recently independent Lyran alliance. 4 worlds fell immediately, shielded only by thin militia units with outdated equipment. The new alliance was now on the knife's edge, potentially ready to fall into an abyss. All news was shut down within the alliance. The new establishment already feared the return of the first prince, Victor, to power, by so quickly displaying their incompetence and incapability to handle the incursion. Dedicated house units were put in the Falcon's path, but it was predicted by the Lyran generals at the head of the alliance that their enemy's primary goal was the major world of Coventry. And this proved to be true. In early March, the last assault on Coventry began. Standing in the defense at the start of the operation were several militia units, as well as 2 regiments of the Sky Rangers, the 10th and the 22nd. The former were considered tested regulars, and the latter were deemed to be as green as grass and were deemed unreliable. Despite this, the 22nd fought almost to the last in the opening of the invasion. The quality of the Rangers' equipment in particular was exceptional, despite the quality of the troops being somewhat lacking. The Jade Falcons were to find their own heavy Omnimex had a machine that could rival them, even if the tonnage wasn't quite equivalent. Moving at the pace of an Inner Sphere Heavy, but almost matching the firepower of a Clan Heavy, the BNC-5S could break down its slightly more maneuverable, but less armored adversaries. One of the most prestigious battle mechs to make it to the field during the fighting, this was a cornerstone piece of armor that helped the defenders' chances to hold out for relief. And undoubtedly, it played its role well. For almost any mech, barring dedicated assaults in the Falcon's arsenal, it was a poor omen to be faced down by this ancient failure, now remade into the image of a true monster. The Falcons, however, were able to rely on their superior skills and numbers to overtake the local militia, and badly mauled the Rangers in the first wave of fighting as well, but not without suffering some losses of their own. The clanners bided their time, tearing into the weak militia units and even the regulars arrayed against them, hitting at their own best opportunities to do so. But things were not to go their way, not by a long shot. Even as the clans won a major victory at Port St. Williams, functionally driving the militia and Sky Rangers from the planet's most vital areas and into the hinterlands, this was not the beginning of a grand victory. The defenders began raiding the occupiers in hit-and-run strikes, before fading into underground locations or forests to hide from Falcon reprisals. This wouldn't win back their world, but it was all they could do while they awaited relief. On April 5th, the Coventry Expeditionary Force, composed of elements of the Eridani Light Horse, Waco's Rangers, and Wolf's Dragoons, arrived in system to relieve the beleaguered defenders. The fight turned into a real challenge to the Falcons with this happening, which was exactly what Martha Pride had wanted. The Falcons inflicted heavy losses onto the mercenaries, but unfortunately for Pride, the now entrenched Falcons suffered badly as well. Supplies became an issue for both sides, and the grueling nature of the fight exhausted both now the unified CEF command, comprised of mercenaries and on-planet Lyran forces, as well as the deployed Falcons. When the rest of the Inner Sphere arrived, and several more regiments of Lyran guards appeared as well, things clearly reached the boiling point. The Falcons had pulled some of their own punches, and much of their two-men was on site or nearby. When the relief forces dropped, led by Victor Steiner Davion no less, it would be a cataclysmic engagement politically for all sides. Neither group could afford to lose, but it was too risky to attempt to win. Thank you. Martha half turned from the 2 busts, then came back around. Oh, and you should know that I will defend this world with everything I have. This is what your people did. and to do less would dishonor them. Carnmother Pride in her remote discussion with the incoming coalition forces. Coventry, 3058. An in-person meeting was held, and Hegira, or honorable surrender, was offered to the Falcons by the First Prince, the true Archon, much to the surprise of everyone, especially given the Falcons' intent to fight to the bitter end only briefly beforehand. Martha accepted. Political and military realities elsewhere meant that Martha had to accept the favorable surrender, but this was unbeknownst to the Coalition at the time. This was the campaign where the BNC-5S, the most famous and dangerous configuration of the Banshee within the 31st century, was truly tested. This was the war where the Dragoons and Steiner deployed it to maximum effect, and where it squared off against clan battlemechs on the field of battle, proving its worth and power. And the Banshee was a part of another key campaign yet still, namely one to destroy Clan Smoke Jaguar. Ironically, another operation caused by the political crisis the Jade Falcons had created by invading Coventry. But it was here, on the very same world, where it was truly put to the ultimate test. It is impossible to say that it did not pass, given the circumstances. This is also the moment where the Banshee had shed its poor reputation. In the forests and mountains and battlefields of Coventry, it proved to be the best that the Lyran Alliance armed forces could put onto the field, and also proved to be a match for the primary nemesis of the houses that built it. If there was one mech to act as a symbol for Steiner victory in the clan invasion era, and its resurgence outside of the Federated Commonwealth, it would be that of the Banshee, standing over their vanquished enemies, proudly painted in the banner of the Lyran state, and showing anyone foolish enough to strike at the heart of the country that they would be delusional to believe that they would not pay a price for it. This was truly the breakout moment for the Mech as it forged its new legacy, rising up to defend the people of the Lyran state from their enemies at the gate. Perhaps the best-known configuration of the Banshee, and the configuration most well regarded for changing the perceptions around it, even more so than the 3S, the BNC-5S is a near wonder weapon as far as the forces of the Inner Sphere were concerned upon its arrival. While some revisions were made after its introduction to place several equally or more devastating mechs in the roster of the Inner Sphere during this era after the fact, during the campaign's near 3050, almost nothing at the time could match this 95-ton assault mech's ferocity on the battlefield. Even clan heavies will be forced into difficult circumstances when confronted by this powerhouse. Using a host of rediscovered technologies, the 5S is a truly frightening sight to be faced with upon its introduction and well beyond. In order to keep critical space open, the 5S comes with a standard internal structure, rather than an endo-steel one. In addition, it has a standard gyro and cockpit, but this is partially due to the technological limitations of the day. In respect to cooling, the 5S is fantastically better served than its predecessor, using Star League-era double heat sinks, and it has 14 of them in total, letting it shed 28 points of heat every turn. If used in protracted engagements, the mech can still run hot, but with range-bracketed fire and cycling its hottest systems during the engagement, it can be kept from the worst heat-related issues. In regards to electronics, there are changes made from the original design, with the 5S now supporting the Angst Clear Channel 3 communications package, as well as the Angst Clear 2A targeting and tracking system. They still don't confer it any bonuses. It possesses the same quirk as its predecessors, namely, the rugged feature. The biggest innovation of the BNC-5S was in its retention of firepower, and having the ability to install a massive power plant on board in order for the mech to achieve a reasonable run rate. With all of this in mind, the 5S is truly a combination of the 3E and the 3S in the most meaningful ways. The engine that makes all of this possible is the Edisich Motors 380 XL Fusion power plant. It still weighs a hefty 20.5 tons, but this is much down from the 41 tons of the standard engine, and allows the mech to reach a maximum speed of 64 km per hour, or 6 movement points in the tabletop game. This means that the 5S moves at the rate of inner sphere battle line formations, allowing it to keep up with most heavies and some mediums. It expands the number of options the mech has for defense and positioning as well, making it all the more dangerous. Notably though, there is a drawback, in that if the BNC-5S loses a side torso, it will automatically be knocked out of action. But this is a price worth paying in this instance, as the exchange is far greater than the vulnerabilities it acquires. Nothing changes, funnily enough, as far as this Banshee goes in regards to its defenses. Matching the plating of the 3S, which matches the plating of the 3E, the 5S continues this arrangement of its armor, but this isn't necessarily a good thing. While it is more heavily guarded than most heavy mechs, it's not quite as protected as most of its peers in the same tonnage range, once again. This is in its own way the mech's greatest weakness, especially considering its XL engine. That being said though, this is more something to be concerned about, and to be taken into account, rather than a true Achilles heel, especially when factoring in that it does lack case to protect it from ammunition explosions. An inner sphere mech that can often match the raw power of several clan designs? It shouldn't be possible, but simply through a smart set of weaponry, and using its tonnage mostly wisely, this Banshee is one of the very best equipped inner sphere battle mechs to challenge a clan-heavy Omnimech. To start with its biggest asset, the 5S comes with a devastating left torso-mounted Poland main Model A Gauss cannon. This is a head-clipping weapon system, and it delivers enough punch to break through armor, especially at respectable distances. The only shortcoming the system has is that it is volatile, and it only has 1 ton of ammunition, 8 rounds. This means that those 8 rounds need to be certain shots, and need to count. Next up is the Banshee's twin, right torso-mounted Defiance 1001 particle cannons. These are ERPPCs, and have approximately the same range as the Gauss rifle, allowing them to pair exceptionally well with it. The main drawback these have is that they can only be fired together every other turn, without beginning to force heat penalties upon the mech. Still, when married to the Gauss rifle, they can potentially do a collective 35 points of damage at a distance, broken up into sets of 10 and 15 damage blocks, which is quite frightening. Then we get into the close quarters systems. This particular Banshee once more has 4 medium lasers, but 2 of them are rear mounted, and the other set are placed in the left arm. This reduces the 5S's firepower in up-close engagements quite substantially, unfortunately when it's compared to the 3S, but at least it does give the mech the ability to try to defend itself from rear attacks. Following these up, it has a center torso mounted small laser, and a head mounted one as well. As the final piece of the puzzle, it has a right arm mounted SRM-6 launcher with 15 rounds of ammunition. This gives it a great follow-up when hitting targets, using it to fish for critical hits. All in all, this is a very dangerous package of weaponry. The mech may have been better served overall being more configured in terms of weapons placements, like the 3S, but it is still superior just due to the quality and technology differences between the two. A truly remarkable and deadly clan invasion destroyer, the Banshee 5S carries with it a long, hard-earned reputation for being one of the best assault mechs of its time. Relatively quick on its feet, heavily gunned, and mostly smartly designed, there are few things that can get in the way to stop it. It may struggle in some respects still, however. The most glaring example of a fault is its relatively light plating for its weight. and that it lacks a case. Its XL engine can also be paired with this, potentially leading to the mech being knocked out of a fight sooner than later. And finally, its ghost rifle is starved for ammunition, meaning that it can't afford to take risky shots with the weapon. But even with every one of these factors taken into account, it is still a nightmare to square off against. When this monster haunts the streets of cities or forests, it is truly the Banshee it is named for, howling and screaming as it annihilates its victims. And Davion, marrying the heir to the Lyran throne? Even if it is a match made in heaven, I somehow have a feeling we'll all be going to hell. Cardinal Francis Flynn, New Avalon Catholic Church, 3026. While not particularly notable in the era after the Clan invasion, the BNC series still had a role to play in what was to come. That era was defined by a conflict so severe that it became the name for the post-Clan invasion. The Federated Commonwealth Civil War tore both the Lyran Alliance and Federated Commonwealth apart. The arrogance of Catherine Steiner Davion was, in a word, shocking. First having become Archon of the Lyran Alliance, and then unlawfully seizing power on New Avalon in 3060, the Inner Sphere was held hostage by someone with even less of a moral compass than almost any other figure of recent times. A narcissist and a psychopath, Catherine's manipulative and ruthless approach to politics managed to secure her a power base in both nations. However, no threat to her power was permitted, even by family, and no dissent could be allowed from the public either. Catherine crushed every noble who stood in opposition to her, with famous incidents like the toppling of the Drusari family on Cantares coming to the fore, and she famously suffocated any public protests as well, controlling the media with an iron grip, and consistently reinforcing her image to as many people as possible. She became the queen of a pair of police states in the Inner Sphere. Backed by her military and intelligence loyalists in both states, a darkness engulfed the realms her parents had unwillingly left to her. The only problem was, much of her support came also through people who had been motivated through their own greed and desire for personal power, and she began to lose hold of these figures in both of the nations she now governed, as her policies and repression put their own skins at risk. Catherine's primary mistake, the thing that let the delicate tyranny she put in place fall away, appears to have been the overt murdering of her brother, Arthur Steiner Davion. Arthur had become a rallying point against her for many within the Federated Sons, and once more being a narcissist and a psychopath, Catherine was not going to let that stand. This heinous act finally resulted in Victor Steiner Davion, who had returned from the Clan invasion to find himself without his role as First Prince, to finally assert that Catherine had to go. None of us wishes to see more conflict, but we can no longer ignore the problems plaguing us. Now we must live with the results, however painful, as we acknowledge the irreconcilable differences that continue to divide my sister from me. It is no longer possible for me to stand back in the interest of peace. The time's come, my people, where no other choice remains. None but war. Broadcast made by Victor Steiner Davion, December 8th, 3062, to the people of the former Federated Commonwealth. Prior to this point, the former Archon Prince had attempted to save lives and avoid conflict by not challenging his sister, knowing that this would devolve into a full-blown civil war. He had seen enough conflict, enough death and destruction, and knowing the clans were still a threat, he wanted to avoid such a miserable outcome. Victor instead became the Presenter Marshal of Comstar, succeeding Frederick Steiner in the role, and seemed poised to accept this new position in life, until Arthur's death. The war was as terrible as one could have predicted. Almost every world of the Commonwealth was impacted in some way as civilians. Soldiers, officers, and nobles picked sides. 4 years of bloody fighting finally came to a head on New Avalon, where Catherine was forced to capitulate to her brother's forces. Knowing he couldn't stay in power with any authority after the hell he'd unleashed, Victor let both House Steiner and Davion go. His brother Peter became Archon, and his sister Yvonne became First Prince. The massive industrial base of the Lyran state and the military know-how of the Federated Sons were turned in on themselves. Like one can imagine, the Banshee was employed by both sides in this hellish family argument. Not only was this the case, but Defiance even produced 2 wholly new variants of the Mech due to its strong reputation and newly found success. The real issue around the Banshee during the war was more to do with the nature of the Fedcom Civil War, with it being spread across such a wide area. This played havoc on lines of communication and even coordinating where new deliveries could be deployed. It also did not help that infrastructure and industries across the Lyran side of the Federated Commonwealth were absolutely devastated by the war, hindering support for battlemech procurement in general as the economy entered into a tailspin. Recovery took priority in the Commonwealth more than anything else, which meant that despite producing new configurations of the Banshee, and in spite of still producing the 5S, mechs like this rescinded in the immediate aftermath of the conflict, which was in its own way tragic, beyond simply referring to the balance sheets of the owners of Defiance Industries, as mechs like this were needed more than ever, given what was to come in the wake of the downfall of Catherine's tyranny. Using engine technologies stolen from the Wolf's Dragoons, Defiance Industries opted to go with a new BNC model in 3062, one with less danger to onboard engine destruction, adopting endosteel to save weight, and reducing its heatsink total to 10. The 6S tries to implement a huge new engine, which is the 31-ton 380 light fusion power plant. These engines offer less weight than a standard, but aren't as light or as vulnerable as a full Star League XL engine either. This gives the 6S more survivability, if only because it can lose an entire side torso without being automatically knocked out, though it will be somewhat crippled from the experience. This power plant was also chosen clearly to make room. Why? Because the 6S was built to accommodate a heavy Gauss rifle, mounted in the left and center torso, more than anything else. This is one of the hardest hitting systems in the history of man. With 16 rounds of ammunition, it can go. The main backup for the system? A right torso mounted LB-10X autocannon with 2 tons of ammunition, and a case for said ammunition. It also has a small laser in the head. It rips things open with the heavy Gauss rifle and LBX slugs, before it shreds targets with cluster rounds. While it might not be the most heavily gunned assault mech that has ever been, it's still certainly formidable in its own way. In 3063, another Banshee started to leave the factories on Hesperus, and once more embraced light fusion engine technology. This time around, it was clearly aimed at competing with the 5S though. The Banshee-7S maintains much of the same internal build, outside of its light engine and endosteel internal structure, and its weapon systems are very similar. It once more has a Gauss rifle, and this time with 2 tons of ammunition. Then it has a single ER PPC in the left arm. After this, it has 4 ER medium lasers, with 2 in the right arm and 1 per side torso. Finally, there is a right torso-mounted SRM-6, and a small laser. Its ammunition is also protected by a case. It has less firepower than the 5S, but overall it has more sustainability. It also forward faces all of its medium lasers, enhancing its forward fighting ability in close. Overall, it's a very tough mech to fight. It's more durable, and still has deadly firepower. It also doesn't overheat as much. There really isn't much to criticize, beyond the fact that it only has a single PPC. That trade, I am sure, is something that many Mechwarriors would be willing to make. All of history is a river, driven by currents of inertia that few can resist, and fewer still can hope to comprehend. Great men are those who can see the currents and navigate them to glory, but only a true master can find a way to tame the currents themselves, to use history's own momentum as an instrument of true change. An excerpt from Thomas Marik's Final Days, 3081. One of the darkest eras of humankind was, in fact, the Blakist assault on the Inner Sphere. In the aftermath of the Fedcom Civil War, it became clear to the leaders of the various great houses, for the most part, that the Star League could not continue. The clan threat had been curbed, though not halted, but the houses themselves had lost their common cause with one another, needing to focus on their own internal affairs, rather than maintaining the international system. The lords of several great houses pulled out, in effect, ending the reborn Star League. This act enraged the half of Comstar that had formed into the Word of Blake. With hidden worlds, vast armies, cyborgs, brand new terrifying Omnimechs, production from the Free Worlds League, and a fleet of warships, they turned their fury upon the Inner Sphere that had rejected their prophecies. A huge wound opened in the middle of human space as the Word of Blake launched its assault, scattering over the planets of the Great Powers. Some of their most primary targets were the major industrial centers of the Inner Sphere, worlds like Hesperus and Irian. These were then turned into dark forges of their own designs. In some instances, they built ancient war machines like the Atlas II and other horrors, though they also repurposed Lyran designs for their own sinister purposes as well. One of the most prominent mechs they reworked was, in fact, the Banshee. Instead of now fighting on the side of the Lyran Alliance, these haunting spirits were turned upon their own people. What had once been the mailed fist of the Commonwealth was now a clawed gauntlet, reaching out to strangle them. But the reign of the Word of Blake was not to last forever. Devlin Stone, a man who emerged within the former Steiner space, in fact, rose to unite the people of the Inner Sphere in a war against the Word of Blake and their mad and delusional drive for power. As this tragedy unfolded, another did in turn. Archon Peter Steiner Davion, only a handful of years into his reign, openly supported the attempt to oppose the Word of Blake, and for his trouble he was assassinated by one of their operatives in 3073. His successor, Adam Steiner, of propaganda fame, rose to replace him, and was to be the one who tried most to heal the badly wounded realm in the aftermath of the Word of Blake's destruction, to which he played a role himself in defeating, and also from the devastation of the Fedcom Civil War. Unfortunately for the Lyran Commonwealth, as the country was once more renamed, Adam Steiner, while a capable leader, did not leave behind a worthy successor, and no amount of money, industry, or military power could save them from what the legacy of his rule unleashed. A Blakist advancement on the Banshee line of battle mechs, the BNC-8S, introduced during their occupation of the world in 3070, is an exceptional machine, and is one that uses a cutting-edge series of technologies for its era of development. First and foremost, it has a 380XL engine once more, letting it keep its maximum speed of 64 km per hour. However, it also has TSM, or triple strength myomers, letting it run potentially even faster when overheating, and giving it immensely powerful physical attacks. For cooling, it can vent up to 26 every turn, letting it use a large portion of its weaponry safely, or it can deliberately overheat to gain a TSM bonus. One major drawback is its XL gyro, however, making it much more likely to be disabled through a mobility kill. Unlike almost every prior Banshee, however, the 8S has a huge 18 tons of standard plating on board, giving it 288 points of armor. Given that it has to protect an XL engine, XL gyro, and volatile components, the protection this mech had needed to be meaningful. A case is on board, though this will mostly protect the pilot, more so than the mech. Much like many Blakist designs, it also has a C3 system as well, letting it network with a master, and others when available. Finally, it has a Guardian ECM, giving it an extra layer of protection. All of these factors together would make the 8S very capable, but now let's examine the weapons it brings to the field, and they are noteworthy. In the right arm you'll find a snub-nosed PPC, an excellent system for close-range fighting, followed up by an ER medium laser. In the right torso, an assortment of lasers can be found, including an ER large laser, 3 ER medium lasers, and an ER small laser. This lets it rip into targets and generate heat as needed for its TSM system. Then, going into the left torso, it has an LB-10X with 2 tons of ammunition, letting it fire solid or cluster rounds. All of this is superb in regards to its firepower. The 8S also has a left arm deployed hatchet. When coming in with its TSM, this Titan is absolutely terrifying in close. In short, this Banshee is relatively quick, hits very hard, and has all of the tools to be a nightmare if not addressed immediately by opposing forces. Its main weakness? It has an abundance of things that can go catastrophically wrong on board if it takes heavy fire, or suffers a through armor critical. Still, the 8S is a brutal fighter. 1 year after the deployment of the 8S, the 9S was put into production by the Blakists during their reign of terror. Looking to adopt the opposite role of the 8S, the 9S is a dedicated and powerful sniper. It retains much of what its predecessor did, having the same armor and mostly the same internal components, barring its engine and heatsink total. It uses a 285 light fusion engine in order to accommodate heavier firepower, while it also reduces its vulnerability to engine death. It also has 28 cooling instead of 26, and lacks TSM or a Guardian ECM. Instead, it has a targeting computer on board. So, what does it do when things get into the realm of firepower? In the left torso, it once more accommodates a Gauss rifle, giving it a deadly punch and headshotting ability, as well as 2 tons of ammunition. It then pairs this with a heavy PPC in the left arm, essentially doing the same thing, but without ammunition and a slightly shorter range. These two weapons are a deadly pair to be sure. To follow this up, it has a left arm mounted light PPC as well. For when things do get in close, it has 2 right arm mounted ER medium lasers and a head mounted one as well. Oddly, it has a left torso mounted standard medium laser too. As a finale to its deadly arsenal of destruction, it has a right torso mounted SRM-6 launcher, giving it the ability to crit seek targets that come in too close. All in all, the 9S is exceptionally dangerous as a sniper, due to it combining a targeting computer with 2 major long-range systems, and its close-range firepower is impressive too. It is a very, very deadly upgrade. Everything you've done, Highness, your invasion of the Marik realms, your overture to Clan Wolf, your vendetta against Duke Vedette, everything has been a disaster. Lieutenant General Mayer, during the coup to remove Melissa Steiner II from power, Tharkad City, the Royal Palace, 17th of March, 3141. History seemed to end with the rise of the Republic at the heart of the Inner Sphere. Armies dwindled in size as a new stable norm was established. There were still wars, such as the protracted civil war in the Free Worlds League between the various provinces vying for control over the disunited state, or the Second Combine Dominion War, or even actions by the Capellan Confederation. But as a whole, it was quiet after the destruction of the Word Blake in the Inner Sphere. In this peaceful existence, vast armies were simply unneeded. Traditional mechs, ones used for centuries, were either placed in storage or were outright decommissioned across the Inner Sphere. Mechs such as the Banshee began to vanish from view, even if some of these machines were maintained or even built by Hesperus. They simply weren't needed in the vast numbers they once had been. Politically, House Steiner was one of the primary allies holding together the peace as well, being linked heavily to the new Terran state as one of their core trading partners. They, along with nations like the Rosselhig Dominion and Federated Sons, being so closely partnered with the Republic of the Sphere, ensured that the worst actors left in their proximity were always held in check. During this time of peace, Adam Steiner attempted to restore the Commonwealth to the glory it once had long ago. Though he wasn't wholly successful, still, the huge economic engine of the Commonwealth was reasonably restored, even if it wasn't producing massive amounts of war materials for various conflicts, because there were none, and there wasn't an arms race for much of the Republic era. When the blackout occurred in 3132, everything changed. Even in the years leading up to it, there were rumblings that the status quo might be challenged in some way, but never with the kind of chaos that the blackout had caused. The Republic began to fray very quickly, and the alliance that held the peace almost immediately began to implode. Even more reliable but less friendly actors like the Draconis Combine shifted very quickly into a more aggressive and opportunistic stance. This created fertile ground for many of the ancient machines of war that had gone silent in recent years to make a triumphant return, including such beasts as the Banshee. However, those that walked from the production lines in House Steiner were to have a most grim fate. You see, the Lyran Commonwealth was burdened with perhaps the worst Archon in its history. In the early 3120s, Adam Steiner died, and had been succeeded by his son, Andrew Steiner. Andrew's reign was very short before he passed away from poor luck, suffering from food poisoning while attending the Liberation Street Fair in Tharkad City. It was his daughter, Melissa Steiner, the granddaughter of the famous Adam Steiner, who is perhaps the worst scourge the Lyran state has ever had as their leader. Ill-prepared for the role, both lacking in temperament and training, Melissa Steiner was a jealous, envious, stubborn, unintelligent, vain, prideful, treacherous, and pitiful human being. She lacked in her any form of virtue. Her rule was to single-handedly change the course of history, for the entirety of the Inner Sphere, in fact. With the HPG grid down, Steiner began to invest heavily in Comstar and to a lesser extent the Republic of the Sphere, buying bonds and keeping these enterprises funded. But this began to strain even the impressive treasury and markets of the Commonwealth itself, especially as the Lyrans were playing all sides, rearming themselves, funding pro-Steiner rebels within the Republic to an extent, and planning huge operations. Melissa was simply not content being where she and her nation were prior to the blackout. The Inner Sphere was a game board she aimed to win. First and foremost, by bailing out Comstar, she ensured that they would find a solution to the HPG blackout, and they would inevitably, of course. And when they did, inevitably, House Steiner was to have a controlling stake in the organization easily. For Melissa II, she knew she could therefore potentially stem or open communications as needed, allowing the Commonwealth and her family to not only profit from this exchange, but to use this mechanism of control to overwhelm and influence their rivals across the Inner Sphere. Comstar would be, in essence, a branch of her government that operated across all of human space. The Republic was to be indebted to her as well, meaning that their cooperation in future political events was to be ensured. Everything was going to come up House Steiner from now on. Except that civilians and lesser nobles, plagued with high taxes and endless spending, were increasingly agitated with this burden, clearly not seeing the bigger picture, of course. Vocal protests began in the late 3130s, and Melissa had the perfect solution for that: war. Bordering two splinters of the former Free Worlds League, the Marik-Stewart Commonwealth and the Duchy of Tamarind Abbey, was perfect for this plan. The Mariks were the ancient and sworn enemies of House Steiner, and even in their current, diminished form, they were still somewhat troublesome. Her plan was quite simple: to crush and absorb these territories into the Lyran Commonwealth. The Marik-Stewart Commonwealth, and nearby Irian within the Republic, were the industrial, military, and economic beating hearts of the old League. With these territories under her control, the already undisputed superiority of Steiner Industries would be further enhanced. When all of her plans came together, the Lyran state would be the largest in the Inner Sphere, with the biggest, most powerful and robust industrial base by far, and with influence over interstellar communications, and its Republic neighbor, House Steiner was to be the hegemon of the Inner Sphere. And there really did seem to be a chance of all of this happening. Perhaps if Melissa Steiner II wasn't the one behind all of these plots, this is exactly what would have happened. But it was not to be. Against the shared wisdom of her advisors, and particularly her key confidant and cousin, Trillian Steiner Davion, she struck a deal with Clan Wolf to help in her invasion of the Marik territories. This ended in an absolute disaster, intending on using the wolves as cannon fodder, and then eventually intending on holding something over them to force further compliance. Melissa set her realm up for disaster. The LCAF and Clan Wolf launched Operation Hammerfall in 3137. Inside of these armies were the best the Lyrans could put in the field in regards to their equipment, including the deadly configurations of the BNC series of battle mechs crafted by the Word of Blake almost 2 generations prior. There were many more cutting-edge designs inside of the Lyran formations as well. This was the armored fist the Lyrans intended to ram down the Eagle's throat, and it was by no means neglected or left for want. The Marik Commonwealth was crushed, especially after the killing of Captain General Anson Marik, forcing the people of his nation into occupation in 3138. Tamarind Abbey barely held on, before it reunified with the League. The resurgent and reunified Free Worlds League attempted to counterattack, and did liberate many of their holdings within the remaining duchy. However, they failed utterly to reclaim much of the Marik Commonwealth beyond a few planets, before Alaric Ward and Clan Wolf killed the Warden General of the League, its functional co-leader, Thaddeus Marik. This was the last great success the Steiners could claim. and truthfully most of the heavy lifting had been done by the Wolves up until this point regardless, because now the Lyrans were to reap what they had sown. Holding the Wolves' civilians hostage, Melissa II wrongly believed that this would be a leash which held her allies in place. Instead, Clan Wolf turned its full fury upon the LCAF, having fought alongside them, and being utterly unimpressed and contemptuous of them. The Wolves knew exactly how to play the Steiner's games. They tore the LCAF apart, bypassing set defense lines and shredding anything that got in their way. Orders from Tharkad were awful in the wake of this emerging crisis as well, pouring fuel on the fire of the very disaster. The entire Steiner military fell almost instantly into disarray, and was now fighting for its very existence, as well as the existence of the state. It was never about the equipment. On paper, the LCAF was more than a match for Clan Wolf. The problem was, as always, the quality of Lyran leadership, and even the relatively poor quality of its soldiers as a whole. Doubtlessly there were brave heroes amongst the LCAF who gave up their lives for their comrades to buy time, to stall the Wolves, or to spit in the face of the horrors they now faced. But it just was not reflective of how the campaign was to unfold. The disciplined, bitter, and angry clan warriors, with their superior equipment, training, and leadership, completely overwhelmed House Steiner's military arm. And at that same moment, Clan Jade Falcon II, sensing weakness, cut deep into the Lyrans. Everything had gone wrong. Melissa Steiner herself survived an assassination attempt, as furious officers tried to see her removed from power. It failed, but a very short time later, a successful coup was launched by the military, who then installed Vedette Brewer to power. Vedette had his own schemes as he attempted to keep the state alive, hiring Anastasia Kerensky to hold back Alaric Ward and his band of revenge-fueled wolves, though this too was destined to fail inevitably. The entire state began to fall apart as world after world was lost. It seemed to be the case that the Lyran Commonwealth was very much on death's door. As the situation grew more dire, those in charge began to flail under the pressure, especially after Anastasia Kerensky's defeat at the hands of Alaric. Melissa became Archon once more in these dying days of Empire. "Mercenaries!" Vedette said desperately. "We can contact mercenaries." Trillian looked over at Melissa. The Archon looked away. Suddenly, Trillian understood. For months, years, Melissa had poured Kroner into Comstar, propping up the communications giant in some mad scheme to bolster her power. Trillian would not say it in front of Melissa's enemies, but like all of her schemes, this one had backfired. Now, when the money could have been used in Tharkad's defense, it was gone. So much money had been poured into Comstar, so many resources were tied up, and with the complete destruction of Comstar that was in the process of taking place unbeknownst to the Lyrans, all of that was for naught. With much of their territory in distress, with heavily industrialized worlds seized, or with them heavily damaged from raids or other obstructions, and with all of their financial assets tapped, something strange happened that had never taken place before. The Lyran Commonwealth was functionally, even if not revealed to the public, bankrupt. In other words, they were insolvent. Clearly, under ideal conditions, they could have created war bonds to compensate for this, or even they could have had the central bank on Tharkad begin printing more money. But truth be told, neither of these were a possibility in the short term either. The one certainty in House Steiner's long reign in the Inner Sphere, even during the Fedcom Civil War, or even the Succession Wars, was that the Lyran state was wealthy beyond anything their opponents could have hoped to match. Even if they could have hired mercenaries, the Commonwealth's most loyal allies in this space, the Kellhounds, had been all but annihilated by Clan Jade Falcon during their assault on the state, removing a key support pillar for House Steiner in this dark time. Now with so many planets lost, with so much territory gone, and with financial destruction as well, the Lyran state was absolutely gutted, and it was all the fault of one person, Melissa Steiner II, paid for her crimes and incompetence when the wolves assaulted the capital shortly after the revelation of their default, being killed by them in a final act of defiance. But all is not lost for the Lyran Commonwealth. While turmoil and decline ravaged the country and its people, technological advancements were made in some corners, particularly by the now state-run Defiance Industries and Hesperus. Elements of clan technologies by this point could be found across most of the great powers of the Inner Sphere, but the selection of technology per location was limited by 3138 inside of the Lyran Commonwealth. In spite of all of this chaos and destruction, clan tech was able to be reproduced at scale, including exceptionally rare components like Clantech XL engine technology. And while the LCAF was bled white in manpower and machines as clans Jade Falcon and Wolf tore into them, new war materials with these incredible standards of technology began to emerge, including the latest refit of the venerable Banshee. The new battle mechs that came about because of this were extremely sophisticated, not only in terms of the materials that made them, but in their use of these cutting-edge systems. And of all of these mechs, the one that is perhaps the greatest standout is in fact the mech that stood against the clans during their first foray into the Inner Sphere, when they struck the Lyran half of the Federated Commonwealth, acting as a barrier to the Falcon's greatest would-be victory on Coventry, the Banshee. But these wonder weapons, these new designs and remakes, now came at a time where they could only make so much of a difference. And the country, even as it remained unsteady at the edge of the abyss, was given a brief respite. The clans turned their attention towards Terra. This led to Clan Wolf under Alaric Ward eventually seizing the homeworld of mankind and being declared Ilclan, becoming a new threat for the entirety of the Inner Sphere. There has been an attempt to rally on Tharkad, however. Trillian Steiner Davion, one of Melissa's key advisors, the one who is usually right in her assumptions, was named Archon in the wake of her cousin's death, all while the nation descended to the lowest point in its history. In spite of this, and an unearned reputation of being nearly as dreadful as Melissa II, Trillian went on to show a much more capable streak of cunning and understanding of stellar political affairs around her. Unfortunately, she has been tasked with managing a political disaster the likes of which only the Free Worlds League has seen in living memory, and that was a state that disintegrated into warring factions for the better part of 6 decades, until the Steiner invasion. With her armies depleted, with the treasury empty, and with political rivals emerging across her own territories as the house becomes increasingly unstable, there was little the Archon could do to show off the power and authority of the Lyran Commonwealth in the aftermath of Melissa's complete mismanagement of the government. In this space, in the years immediately after her cousin's death, it looked as though Trillian would be potentially the last Archon of anything resembling a unified Lyran Commonwealth. Periphery regions began to break away, or expanded at the expense of the Commonwealth. The successor states to the reviled Rimworld's Republic, the Timbuktu Collective and Rimworld's territories being the primary examples and beneficiaries to this. However, another problem emerged, one that is far more pressing, with the arrival of a new, massive breakaway region. Clan Jade Falcon's territories had imploded with their defeat on Terra, as almost all of their warriors had been relocated for their assault there, and this power vacuum, unfortunately, sucked nearby, wayward Lyran forces into it. Some regions began to resist Tharkad's rule nearby, too, pushing back against the century of poor leadership. Instability was rampant. Duke Vedette Brewer seized power within these new hinterlands, in a region named the Vesper Marches, creating an openly defiant government. Meanwhile, General Sarah Regis and the 26 Arcturian Guards reforged the Tamar Pact, one of the foundations of the Lyran Commonwealth, as an independent state, free from both the Falcons and Steiner rule. Elements of Clan Jade Falcon too survived in this new mess of the hinterlands, though the most damning breakaway state appears to be the Ark Royal Coalition, led by resurgent Kellhound's leader, Calamity Kell. Trillian had made offerings to all of the Lyran breakaway states and former Falcon holdings to return home, and her offer was firmly rebuffed. She hesitated to immediately leap into action to assault and occupy this region, or even to spur her troops into action, for a multitude of reasons. Tharkat had limited control over its armies, seemingly, as many acted without orders from the capital. Unfortunately, worst of all, the military had proven incapable of dealing with threats abroad almost entirely. From the Free Worlds League military to clans Wolf and Falcon, the LCAF had been found lacking in their ability to win real battles. All of these factors came together to make the Archon overly cautious, only further harming her reputation. But this was not to last forever. Agreed. If Trillian could have sent troops to liberate these worlds, she would have. We can't count on House Steiner to support us. Major Karl Friedrich, Advisor to Calamity Kell, October 12th, 3151. War is now on all sides of the Commonwealth, whether Tharkat likes it or not. The reclamation of wayward territories is now the firm policy of her government, even if it had been slow to act due to internal discord. There are also many actors within the state, such as Trillian's cousin Roderick Steiner or her other distant relative, Ludwig Steiner, both of whom have their own agendas. The latter of these powerful relations has propped up Trillian's government in many ways, and he, most of all, seems to understand that in order to save House Steiner, they must show strength against their enemies. Enemies within the Free Worlds League, Periphery Border, the former Falcon territories, breakaway regions, and the Wolf Empire. However, the Lyran military has yet to recover from the mauling it received from the clans, and there is a genuine chance it may never. While House Steiner possesses the forges of Hesperus and several key worlds, it has lost much. The army is also questionably loyal to the head of state, and local commanders hold much greater sway than Tharkat itself. Despite having brilliant battle mechs at their disposal, such as the BNC series, especially in its current form, the army is now simply much smaller and cannot support the numbers they once had. Making things more complicated still, experienced soldiers and officers were killed by clans Wolf and Falcon, meaning many, though not all, of their formations are very green. The military traditions and histories of the army, too, were already questionable at best. In the aftermath of the Federated Commonwealth Civil War, many of the innovations the Davions had instilled into the Steiner side of the military were deliberately discarded. The truth is, the LCAF, if House Steiner is to survive, must evolve past what it has been. It can no longer be an army of endless material and manpower, used only to be thrown at opponents with little consideration, as it wants for both. The quality of the average soldier, Mechwarrior, officer, and overall commander must rise to a new level of competence in order to fight back against the darkness that now threatens to once more swallow the Lyran Commonwealth whole. Titanic battlemechs such as the Banshee are once more the face of this struggling armed force. Ludwig Steiner, the most aggressive figure in Steiner politics at this time, pilots the newest iteration of this colossus, recognizing it for its capabilities in the field, but also for what it has represented over the past century in the armed conflicts House Steiner has waged. While they may not be able to field whole armies of mechs at this quality as they once did, Their highest quality can only be matched directly by clan adversaries, as they have pushed past what any other house, as of now, can construct. If the Steiners fail in their quest to restore the nation, it will not be because of its engineers, technicians, designers, or their remaining industries, as they have delivered them spectacular behemoths. If House Steiner fails now, it will be because they had become rigid over time, so much so that they could not address the crises that changed the fabric of the country. Ton for ton, the Banshee can stare down any foe, bringing its ancient frame and new weaponry to bear, and breaking them down piece by piece. The real question is, can its pilots match the ferocity of their mount? As armies collide with their neighbors on every side of the embattled state, from the Bolin region on the League border, to the Wolf Empire, to the chaotic hinterlands and Periphery's edge, we will find out in due time if they can rise to the challenge. But even if they fail, it is clear that House Steiner has opted to not simply go into the night quietly, beaten, broken, and defeated. They will rage against the hand fate has dealt them, and that they have dealt themselves. They will rage against the dying of the light, and should they vanish into that darkness, their fury will echo long past their defeat. The deadliest Banshee devised in its long 700-year history, the Banshee-12S is the embodiment of a monster. Built with the highest quality components available to the Inner Sphere as a whole in terms of its core construction, and designed to be the ultimate fusion of the BNC-3S, 5S, and 8S, this Titan will break the back of even the hardest of adversaries. To start with, it has an endo-steel internal frame, letting the mech save several tons. After this, it uses a standard gyro and cockpit, which are logical choices for the mech. Cooling-wise, it once more has the ability to dump 28 heat per turn. In regards to its defense, it has 18 tons of armor, once more offering 288 points of protection, while also this time having a case system on board for volatile materials. Its engine is where the real value is, as it is a 20.5 ton Clantech 380XL power plant, letting it run up to 64 kilometers per hour, all while taking up as much critical space as a light fusion engine. This means that while losing a side torso would be very problematic, it won't immediately knock the mech out of an engagement, and may give it time to retreat, or possibly finish off the opposition it has, before dying itself. Mobile, well-guarded, and very durable despite its advanced components, its internal systems are robust to say the least. And things still get taken up a notch when we observe its other weaponry. To get started, it has twin Clan ER small lasers, with one in the center torso and one in the head. These hit as hard as traditional Inner Sphere medium lasers. Then it has 4 Clan ER medium lasers installed into the right torso. Once more, these functionally hit with the range and power of Inner Sphere large lasers, making them very reliable damage dealers to say the least. After taking account of these, it has twin Inner Sphere ER PPCs with one in the left arm and one in the right torso, followed by a Gauss rifle in the left torso with 16 rounds of ammunition. This mirrors the 3S and 5S quite closely, including potentially causing heat issues, but it's still a decent level of firepower, even for the Dark Age and Ilclan era. Finally, it retains a right torso mounted SRM-6, letting it shotgun targets that come in too close. Overall, the Banshee-12S is the best Banshee to have ever marched across a battlefield. Its fighting power cannot be matched by almost any of its peers, and while a clan assault mech might still prove to be a cut above it in some circumstances, that is a very high bar for an Inner Sphere battle mech to clear. Relatively quick, very heavily gunned, and thickly armored, the BNC-12S is the ultimate manifestation of what the Banshee can become in its current form. It is the ultimate Steiner fighting machine at this time, and it is rightly feared. In times of great danger, the best person for any job that gives life and death power over the people is usually the one trying his damnedest not to be chosen. From Fighting in the Commonwealth, a biography of General Edward Regis, by Eric Jolin, Skrunk Publishers, 3025. There is something to be said for failure. Failure teaches lessons, sometimes very hard ones, specifically to the ones who come up short. It is through failure that we learn. It is through failure that we grow. And the Banshee most definitely did grow from the time of its introduction. Originally built by the Terran Hegemony for their armed forces, this assault mech was seemingly dated from the second it first walked onto the battlefield. It was a new mech, but built on old ideas, and even when a radical new approach was made, it was the wrong one, dooming the machine to mockery and obscurity. Thousands of these mechs languished for centuries in backline roles, or unwanted stockpiles. Only through the insight of designers at Defiance Industries was the Banshee given a chance to not only demonstrate its power, but to, in its own way, participate in saving the Lyran people. The one-time object of ridicule instead became the mailed fist of the Lyran state, rising so high as to become a rival of the Atlas during the Forced Succession War. This titan stood tall with the victorious forces of the Federated Commonwealth, but most notably, House Steiner, in the years after the greatest victory of the Succession Wars. But its journey hardly ended here, becoming one of the only battle mechs in the entirety of the Inner Sphere that could trade shots with the sinister and advanced clan battle mechs that struck the Great Houses in the 3050s. By the end of their invasion, few would remember the pitiful origins of this once reviled battle mech. It transcended centuries of poor performance by becoming the mech the Inner Sphere needed most in their darkest hour. This positioned the Banshee at the top of the mountain, along with other legendary pieces of armor, finally earning it its rightful place there. Now, the Lyrans, in their time of need, have called upon this behemoth once again. Wherever the situation is at its worst, one can see the Banshee at the head of the pack, not running from danger, but into it for the sake of the citizens and soldiers who suffer in this new era of strife. The Mechwarriors who take up the controls of these mighty chariots now find themselves in the role of firemen, fighting to stop the flames from consuming their homes and nation. They, and their comrades, are so lucky to have this steel companion at their side. This one mech is responsible for saving the lives of millions of Lyran citizens, since its resurrection from death or slavery. It is the symbol of resistance in the face of savagery and injustice imposed from the outside. If one looks at the equipment of the army as warriors within the ranks of the military itself, fighting alongside the soldiers who rely on it, rather than just being used by them, then without a doubt, the Banshee, in its odyssey from a forgotten hulk, despised by so many, to its revival, proving its mettle as a defender of those who breathed life into it once more, has truly walked the path of a hero whose long watch is not yet over. Tomorrow's gonna be the day. Everything is in place. The pieces are already moving. I couldn't call it off if I wanted to. And, I'll be honest, a part of me wants to. This idea, a new Tamar, it's the biggest thing I'll ever do, and it's scary as hell. The doubts I feel now are going to be shouted back at me tomorrow, 1,000-fold, and for a long time to come. I know what they'll say, that we're just another splinter of a once great nation soon to be gobbled up by one of the sharks that surround us. That we're just another upstart, pissant faction, led by a warrior queen with delusions of grandeur. That we're just some echo of a long-dead nation. A vacant idea with no identity of our own. That we're doomed to fail. But I don't believe any of that. No one with me believes that. We're committed to doing what's right. To act on behalf of those who need our protection. To show our timid leaders that fortune truly does favor the bold. I see that commitment in the eyes of those I serve with. I see the fire they carry inside, and it silences my doubt. That commitment is a promise to each other, a reassurance that our aim is true and our course is set. That commitment is the pure pact we have made with each other, and the pact will endure. Tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Video entry by General Sarah Regis, 12th of August, 3151. Thank you all, by the way, for joining me here today. First of all, I want to mention producing videos like this takes weeks or months worth of work, and I genuinely hope that you all enjoyed it. If you did, or even if you didn't, I'd appreciate your feedback, and hitting like or dislike, and leaving me a comment regarding what you thought of all of this definitely does help. I really mean it, it helps the channel out. And on top of that, I appreciate it, and I do like seeing what you guys all think. I do read every comment. Yes, even the mean ones. I do have a couple other things I want to go over here in the outro, however. Let's start with the fact that this is the first big video of 2025. If my voice breaks up at all at the moment, I am fighting a bit of a throat infection, so you'll have to forgive me. The original Banshee video, before this remaster as I'm calling it, was really the beginning of me talking about the lore on the channel, and how the mechs exist within the boundaries of it. It felt right making this the first one I redid, and it also felt right to put as much effort into it as I have. It, as a mech, has become very special to me as a result, so I hope I did it, and the Lyran Commonwealth, justice in this video. To address a small point, there is some feedback that I get from some who don't enjoy or appreciate the hybrid videos I make, where I cover the factions and events around the factions, and how these mechs exist within that space all at once. And to be clear, it is a delicate balance to walk. It is very difficult to determine what is essential to keep the viewer informed, versus what is too much, versus what is just wholly unnecessary, and sometimes I may get that mix wrong. But I do it because I think the mechs don't just exist in a vacuum. The events of the setting play into the creation of the machines, and why they get deployed, and who they get deployed against. Sometimes personalities play a big role in it too, and I just want to give people what I consider a very complete picture, while weaving a narrative into it as well, a story through and through. I also do my best to not make any mistakes, and I have a full list of all of the resources I poured through to create this video. However, sometimes they do happen. A mistake in editing, a human error in script writing, or just something not coming across as I intended can happen in these videos. The only way to be truly fully informed on these subjects is to read all of these source materials yourself. Just to be clear, I am by no means an oracle, and as I've mentioned, I am not infallible. But I want you all to know My goal is to inform and entertain all of you first and foremost, and any small errors that may appear in video is often because of how complex the videos have become. I don't think this one has any in it, but did accidentally call Michael Cameron Ian Cameron in the Taurian Concordat video despite several quality checks, so you never know. However, this is the beginning of a new year as well, so I just wanted to say thank you to the entirety of the audience who watches and enjoys my videos. I never imagined I'd spend my days assembling these projects, and it's really only possible because so many of you enjoy them. So sincerely, thank you. Here's the part where I start giving shoutouts for who helped me in some way with the video, by the way. The first one is going off to Ray Arastia, the line developer at Catalyst Game Labs, who answered some of my questions earlier last year regarding this video, and that resulted in the Coventry section of it. It even made sure the downed and dead burning Mad Cat image was made by Alan Blackwell, funnily enough. Speaking of Alan, I can't thank him enough for his artwork and what he's put into crafting these images for the channel. They really bring all of these projects to life. Thank you, Alan. I'm eternally grateful. I also want to give a shout out and special thanks to Starrytech Designs, who is the person I received permission from to use a certain number of his images for the beautiful stellar backgrounds which I use in the video. I also want to mention that all of the resources used in this video will have links to them in the top pinned comment in the comment section. I'm also going to say I want to give a huge thank you to all of the artists who've ever worked on Battletech, who've created the visual designs that we see in the setting. And finally, I want to give a huge thank you to all of the YouTube channel members who support these projects. I really say this and I mean it. The YouTube channel members are what allow me to make these videos. I can't thank you all enough. On the screen, you are going to see all of the current Captain Generals who have supported this channel's art. But specifically, I want to give a massive shout out to Telos, Thomas Craker, Invictus Anime, Rye Fields, Chad Layden, Besker, Robert St. John, Earthquake Johnson, War Hippie, Adherent of Lady Columbia, Iron Darkness, Kaylee86, and Manakoa. Again, thank you all for your support. I'm eternally grateful to all of you, and to the other channel members as well. And with all that being said, I don't think there's anything more I have to add in this particular video. So I will catch you all in the comment section below.